Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Ghost in the Machine in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 41, A Guilty Conscience. Even after 9 seconds had opened his eyes, he still had trouble understanding what had just happened. There had been a gust of wind, like all the air pressure in the city just dropping in an instant. He'd felt his ears pop. There had been a deafening boom. The ground had shaken. 2B. 60 shouted out, clinging to his side. 2B. Where was she? She'd been right here next to Nines just a second ago. There she was, standing in front of Undyne. No one stops but here, now, despite her best intentions, Undyne had. 2B stood like a crumbling colossus, swaying on weak and unsteady legs, her arms crossed and her golden sword braced against her forearm in a defensive reverse grip. Across the street. Chara Dreamer. Even at this distance, Nines could see a flash of shock in their single remaining eye. 2B shifted to a combat stance, shifting the grip of the sparkling Joyeuse as a kaleidoscope of colors danced on its blade and leveling its tip at Chara. Chara took a step back, their own massive gold sword falling to their side. Nines. Undyne, 2B huffed, her breathing shallow despite her defiance, take 60, and run. 2B, wait. Nines let go of 60. You can't, not alone. She was still weakened from the stab wound in her stomach. Even with the entry and exit wounds sealed, there was still internal bleeding to be concerned with, and the blood she'd lost wasn't anywhere near being fully replenished, never mind what might have happened when her sword and body had absorbed the brunt of that shockwave. 2B looked back at him, her weary face framed by wild and disheveled snow-white bangs, and smiled a shaky and confident smile. She made a single half-hearted lunge forward before every part of her body went limp. Nines and Undyne caught 2B as she collapsed, still conscious, but barely. Pod 042 was already rattling off diagnostic errors in its impeccably monotone voice, mentioning disruptions in her circulatory system, multiple hairline fractures running through her chassis, and a dozen other points of failure at such a rapid pace that its voice began to overlap with itself. Emboldened, Chara strode across the street, hefting their blade. Nines grabbed his own, some small part of him hoping maybe he could parry the next strike without being torn nearly to pieces, but as he raised his blade, a burst of static and a flurry of error messages ran through his HUD, accompanied by a wave of stinging pain that engulfed his body from head to toe and brought him to his knees. Whether it was a side effect of whatever that cursed knife had done to him, or simply bad timing, Nines felt helpless in a way he hadn't felt in a long, long time. Nines would never forget what Chara had said as they'd stood over him and 2B, ready to end all of their troubles with a single casual swing of a sword. How they had looked away, their eye meeting 60's fearful gaze and the cold and stern grit in their face so much like Commander White's infamous glare, Nines had observed melting away. And spoke 4 words that changed everything. 60. It's me. Lucky. As Nines puzzled over this bizarre statement, Chara doubled over, groaning and clutching at their head, their fingers digging so deep they left welts in their skin. 9's first thought was that Chara had been infected with a logic virus, but as scarlet as their eye was, there was no bright red light in their pupil that would indicate that affliction. This was something else, their stolen body's original consciousness reasserting itself, maybe? I don't know how long I can stay in control. You guys. 60, Nines, 2B, Chara's voice was soft and weak, their breathing shallow. There was a quaver in their voice as it cracked and broke. Run while you still can. They had run. For the next 47 days, Nines would run. For the past 47 days, Nines had been running. Running first to collect the materials to help Alphys repair 2B, not the best materials to work with, admittedly, pale imitations of Yoarha android components fabricated in secret and under cover of darkness, and trying to ignore how sacrilegious it felt to cram substandard parts into 2B's body and pray for a miracle. Running next to gather data on Chara's new regime, its strengths, its weaknesses, hounded all the while by the King's Royal Guard, who could no longer be placated, even as Undyne did her best to run interference using her position as captain. With no backups and no wealth of replacement parts to rely on, a tapestry of scars grew on his body as a testament to the risks he took and the battles he fought. Running now to run away, because gazing at 2B's face, soft yet blank, warm yet cold, living yet dead, day after hopeless day, had become to Nines a kind of personal hell. Pod, scan for black box signals again. Pod 153 took a few minutes to run its scans. Nines stuffed his hands into his pockets as he waited. Kman. Kman. He tapped his boot on the ledge and stared down at the cluttered street 12 stories below, lit by the glow from street lamps as the luminous stones set into the ceiling of the cavern far above dimmed to approximate encroaching nightfall. Everything looked more or less the same as it had 2 months ago. Nines wished he could say he could almost smell a moral rot pervading the air that had taken hold of the city ever since Chara Dreamer had murdered their father and taken control of the underground. But he couldn't. The city still smelled like a million different kinds of food and a little bit of garbage, same as it always had. Things had seemed much simpler back on the surface. In war, you knew your enemy. Sometimes you gained ground, sometimes you lost ground, sometimes you got stuck in a stalemate, but machines were always machines and androids were always androids. Down here, though, some monsters who'd spent their entire lives as subjects under King Ascari fell in line under Chara without question, many praising them as some sort of angel figure. Some monsters did so grudgingly, muttering their reservations under their breath even as they bent their knees. Some snarled in defiance, and others just carried on as if nothing had changed, whether out of denial or resignation. Nines wanted to grab some of these monsters by the shoulders and shake them until he could hear their brains rattling in their skulls. Didn't they know who their enemy was? Pod 153 let out a soft chime, breaking Nines out of his reverie. Scan complete. At last, the results of Pod 153's scan popped up on 9's visor. Nothing new. 2 black box signals in the ruins, 1 black box signal on the rooftop where Nines was currently standing, and 1 black box at the castle where Chara sat on their ill-gained throne. The 6 signals from the black boxes Ascari had harvested over the centuries were still gone. Nines had noticed it the first time he'd poked his head out of the ruins, about a day after he and Alphys had finished their repairs to 2B. Undyne had been the one with the plan, which had taken both Nines and Alphys by surprise. Nines would use Pod 153 to scan for the black boxes and point out the location of the 6 to Undyne. Undyne would creep into the castle, easily enough with the rank and security clearance level afforded to her as captain of the Royal Guard, steal the 6 black boxes, kill Chara stone dead with extreme prejudice, and take all 7 souls to shatter the barrier and free the kingdom. Toriel could take the throne if she liked, everyone could move to the surface and relieve the kingdom of its overcrowding problem, and, while there were still plenty of dangers on the surface, even though Sixo had said the machine network had been severely crippled, everyone could live happily ever after. But wherever Chara had hidden those black boxes, they weren't showing up on scans anymore. Nines had tried again and again. He had tried running scans from various vantage points throughout the kingdom. Every time, he'd come up short, much to Undyne's mounting frustration. "I'm sick of having to pretend to lick this bastard's boots, Nines," she'd hissed at him one night during a clandestine meeting. He couldn't fathom how the signals had vanished. Had Chara removed the black boxes from the stasis tubes Ascari had been keeping them in, effectively taking them off of life support and reducing them to inert hunks of machinery? Too risky. What if they couldn't be powered back on when the time came to use them? Or had Chara figured out some way to cloak the unique signals they emitted? Unlikely. Not without Alphys' willing help, and most certainly not in such a short time frame. Nothing made sense. And of course, Nines couldn't spend nearly as much time as he'd like getting to the bottom of this mystery because... "You there? Stand up. Put your hands above your head." Nines sighed. Because this happened. This was the normal routine. Go out, do some research, get caught, run back home. Still, 19 hours outside of Toriel's house before getting spotted was nearly double his previous record for excursion lengths. Time to go home. For what? So he could spend another few days sitting next to 2B's bed and waiting for her to wake up? Nines had to accept the truth. Every time he'd hacked into her, had laid her systems bare, he'd searched for some spark of awareness inside her, some sign that there was still capacity for thought behind blue eyes he hadn't even seen for nearly 50 days. But he'd never found anything. He had to face facts. The lights were on, but there was nobody home. 2B was gone. And as much as Chara had struck the final blow, Nines shouldered the blame as well for being so cocky and self-assured, for always getting himself into trouble, to always force 2B to leap headlong into danger to protect him. But she wouldn't come to his rescue this time. And that was his fault. His fingers were starting to feel itchy again anyway. The combat protocols he'd copied off of 2B's comatose body and installed to his own operating system, sending anticipatory tingling through his skin. He'd never felt so ready for a fight. He knew androids were programmed to love combat, even ones like him, but this it was on a different level altogether. He wanted to make these bastards pay. He'd kill Chara, even if it meant dying in the process, even if it destroyed the kingdom's last hope for breaking the barrier and leaving this wretched mountain. Fiat Iustitia, et Periat Mundus. Nines glanced over his shoulder. Just one member of the royal guard in a dark grey cloak, clasping a cutlass in a shaking hand. He'd come up the stairwell to the roof and was now blocking the door. If Nines wanted to get down, he'd have to choose between the stairs or jumping off the side of the building. The guard was trembling, a nervous grin stretched across his wide, sallow amphibian face. He probably wasn't as alone as his demeanor let on, unfortunately. Nines stood up straight, lowered his hood, and pulled off the simple mask he'd been using to hide his face. These days, it was dangerous to go around bearing a human face in the kingdom, hooking it onto one of his belt loops. I said hands above. Yeah. As he raised his hands, Nines used his NFCS to summon a sword to each one in his right hand, his own sword, the cruel oath, its black hilt and coppery blade as familiar as an old friend under his curling fingers, in his left hand, 2B's sword, the virtuous contract, registered to his NFCS in her stead. The NFCS, or Near Field Combat System, varied in its permissions between YoRHa models. Non-combat models, such as Type D and Type S models, were allotted a single weapon registered to their system at any given time. Type O models, who never even left the bunker, had no NFCS installed at all. Most combat models, like 2B, could use their NFCS to store and carry two weapons simultaneously. Nines had hacked into his own systems and boosted his NFCS's range to hold up to 6 weapons at a time. This way, he had thought as he'd transferred combat data from 2B's body into his own and taken her swords, "You'll still be with me, 2B." But up here, he still felt so alone. His reflexes and the strength of his synthetic muscles heightened by the Type E combat protocols augmenting his scanner protocols, Nines whipped around and with a single blow tore the cutlass from the guard's slick, webbed hand. His second blade trailing behind the first cut the monster across the chest, easily penetrating his cloak but meeting unexpected resistance beneath. He may have had the instincts of a combat model now, but Nines still had the keen eyes of a scanner, and beneath the torn cloak he saw. What the hell? The cloak sloughed off the froggish guard's shoulders to reveal what looked suspiciously like heavy armor intended for YoRHa combat units. But that was nuts, because first off, where the hell would anyone down here get their hands on YoRHa combat armor, and second, all YoRHa combat units were female, so why was this armor tailored to fit a short, slightly doughy frogman? Alphys must have snatched the blueprints while Pod 042 and 153 had been feeding her information on android construction, probably out of nothing more than curiosity. It seemed Chara's regime had forced her into building these suits for its jackboots. Well, that was great. The frogman's mouth twitched again, then shot open, a long pink tongue whipping out from the gaping pink maw and hitting Nines square in the chest with all the sting of a whiplash, tearing away a part of his coat as it came free with a sickeningly wet sucking sound. As Nines reeled back, the guard's tongue wrapped tightly around his right wrist, cutting into his skin, and then the frogman leaped a full 5 meters up into the air on thick, spring-like legs and sailed over the edge of the roof. The slimy, sticky tongue went taut. Nines chuckled and raised the virtuous contract, ready to bring it down on the poor bastard's tongue and cut himself free. Dumbass. It was then that 9's feet left the roof and he careened to the edge himself, tumbling through the air as the tongue tying him went slack. The froggish guard lay on the wall of the skyscraper below for a split second until Nines swung through the air, then he was above, hands and feet splayed and stuck to the rough bricks as if glued to them. Nines felt himself swing in an arc around the guard, the wind rushing in his ears, his hair and coat flapping. Pod. Target and fire. Pod 153, though struggling to keep up with him, heard 9's command and opened fire, its bullets glancing off the frog guard's armor at first but soon reaching his head and shattering it like an overripe melon. The rest of his body crumbled to dust, leaving nothing but an empty suit of armor that fell to the street below. The tongue wrapped around 9's wrist crumbled into dust as well. He had little time to celebrate his freedom, though his angular momentum was still carrying him through the air. As he careened through the air, he held up his arms and braced himself, squeezing his eyes shut. Nines crashed through a window and tumbled through a long hallway, skidding on a rough carpet until he came to a stop, littered with chips of broken glass. He stood up and dusted himself off. The hair on the back of his neck stood up as a chill ran down his back, and Nines stepped to the side just as a broadsword swung down to cleave him in two. So there were royal guards down here, too. Nines ran the first guard through with one sword, lifting them high into the air and letting them slide down the blade before their body disintegrated and their armor fell to pieces, his muscles burning under the strain of the guard's weight. Undyne had made Nines promise not to kill any monsters, not even ones loyal to King Chara. Monsters were still monsters, after all, no matter who they bowed to. Fuck that. Chara had taken 2B away from him, and with each passing day, it became clearer that she wasn't coming back. Not only did Chara deserve to die, but the lives of anyone who bent their knee to them didn't mean a damn thing to Nines either. He'd slaughter all of them if he had to, no matter what Undyne said. And if 2B really was gone for good, then Nines wouldn't stop once he'd finished dealing with these guards. He'd cut a path of destruction right to Chara's castle and make Chara's death slow and painful, no matter how many stupid magic swords they'd collected, and damn the consequences, damn whatever fate awaited this kingdom next. 2B had been his older sister, his rock, his everything, and Nines was going to take everything away from Chara. The remaining guards fell back as gunfire rang out from behind Nines and bullets whizzed over his shoulder, glancing off their armored chests. Observation: enemies appear to be wearing equipment designed to imitate Yoarha heavy armor, Pod 153 offered. While less resilient than authentic armor, the utility of long-range combat systems is highly reduced. No, really? I hadn't noticed. Nines gritted his teeth and plunged toward the other guards as they blocked the open stairwell at the end of the hallway. Kmin, Alphys. You must have built some fatal flaw into these things in case I ran into them, right? Throwing out his hand, Nines hacked into one of the guard's armor, overjoyed to find not a single firewall or other defensive measures in the suit's software components. How could he have ever doubted that Alphys would give him a backdoor? Deactivating the environment sensors in the guard's helmet and leaving them deaf, blind, and dumb until the suit rebooted gave Nines a delightfully sadistic rush. Pod. Blade. Nines barked, grabbing Pod 153 by its arm as a short, broad energy blade projected in front of it, tearing through the blinded guard's armor like a hot knife through cold butter. The other guard came up behind him. Pod 153 slammed into the side of their head with a mighty crack as it continued to travel along its arc. As the stunned guard reeled, Nines grabbed them, pulled them in front of himself like a living shield, and hurried down the spiral stairwell, his loud footsteps echoing across the walls. How were there so many enemies here waiting for him? Had he been tailed here without realizing it? They must have followed him here and set up an ambush behind him. You won't get away with this, the captive guard bellowed in a thin and reedy voice, squirming under 9's grip. Mark my worms. The phrase is mark my words, pal, said Nines. I know what I said, the guard retorted, yanking off his gauntlet and throwing a handful of worms in 9's face. And handful was the right word, Nines realized as he wiped the slimy, dirt-covered invertebrates off his face, the guard slipping out of his grasp. The guard's right hand was missing, more pinkish-gray worms pouring from his wrist and writhing in a puddle on the floor. Ugh, ew. Oh, God, fuck, Nines moaned as he reeled back, spitting out dirt and writhing earthworms that had gotten in his mouth, brushing off the worms stuck to his skin. There was one trying to worm its way under his visor, even. You get Jim, one of the other guards came out. The rest of Jim the guard's armor collapsed, revealing underneath an enormous segmented worm covered in smaller worms that had approximated a humanoid shape, its skin a translucent pinkish gray with twisted organs visibly pulsing beneath it. The giant worm moved with astonishing swiftness, wrapping itself around 9's legs and chest and pinning his arms to his sides. As Jim reared back his head, a circular mouth wide enough to fit 9's entire head inside and lined with blunt, bumpy teeth opened up at the front of his featureless face. For the first time in his life, Nines realized that earthworms actually had fine, bristly hair covering their slimy bodies. He probably would have found it an interesting factoid for him to remember later if a giant worm wasn't about to grind his head into a pulp. "You're one ugly motherfucker," Nines gasped, cringing as more tiny worms carried themselves off of Jim's main body and began wriggling into his coat. "I'll make you eat those worms," Jim boasted, just before Pod 153 hit him with a barrage of bullets and tore his head to shreds, killing him instantly and freeing Nines. With the earthworm monster dispatched, Nines shrugged off his queasiness and swapped to the Joyeuse, a much heavier sword with greater cutting power, and hurried down the stairs. One of the two guards standing in his path raised a long poleaxe, but before they could strike, Nines buried the shimmering blade of the Joyeuse in their torso and wrenched it free with a shower of blood that almost immediately dried into fine white dust as it made contact with the air. Conjuring an old and rusted black spear he'd found deep in the kingdom's unexplored caverns, Nines planted it against the stairs and vaulted over the still-standing guard in front of him, slinging the spear like a javelin to impale another guard waiting on the landing below through the chest, then grabbed the guard he'd landed behind by the arm, twisted their elbow, and shoved them over the railing. They let out a trailing scream as they fell down the stairwell, their armored body occasionally colliding with the railings below with thud after thud until finally, with a sickening and meaty crack, they hit the ground floor. 9SS next enemy was waiting for him on the next landing, optical sensors blazing green under a hooded red cloak, scaly claws and a lashing reptilian tail poking out from the cloak's decorated hem, and a long and barbed harpoon in the guard's hand with a long chain dangling off its end. His next weapon to deal with this foe was a rusty single-edged greatsword, nearly as long as he was tall, its bronze blade wickedly curved in what felt like a sinful scream captured in metallurgy. Nines prepared to tackle the last guard blocking his path to the ground. That was when every muscle in his right arm burst into flames at once. Nines screamed and fell to his knees, letting go of the sword and clutching at his elbow where the pain was most intense. The burning feeling white-hot, as if molten iron was coursing through his veins, traveled from his wrist up to his shoulder. Alert, muscle structure of Unit 9SS right arm has become inoperable due to extreme overuse. Proposal, avoid further combat and seek repairs immediately. Nines gritted his teeth. It hurt so bad he could barely even breathe, could barely even think. Was it the Type E protocols he'd installed, tricking him into pushing his body beyond what it had been designed to handle? He'd been warned that Type S models had weaker endoskeleton and chassis construction than combat models, let alone Type ES, and weaker muscles as well. The enemy he'd been about to slay drove their barbed javelin into 9SS shoulder, the pain of the blade piercing his flesh mingling with the burning agony infesting his muscles. Nines planted his boot on the guard's chest and shoved them back, then grabbed the javelin's wickedly hooked blade with his free hand and snapped it in a tightening grip, the fragments of the blade lacerating his fingers. Letting his injured arm hang at his side, he grabbed hold of Pod 153 and tossed himself over the railing. The hovering pod allowed him to slow his descent enough so he would float gently onto the concrete floor far below, landing right next to the guard he'd thrown to their death. The sound of his remaining foe's clawed feet stomping on the stairs as they descended on him echoed through the stairwell, pounding in his ears like a migraine set to a beat. Before the guard could catch up with him, Nines pulled up his hood, put his mask back on, and bolted out of the building. The streets were as chaotic as ever, and even more so once Nines had hacked the traffic lights and brought the entire block to a gridlocked standstill. It was easy to get himself lost in the crowd and stay that way until, a few blocks away, he found a suitable alley to duck into and lay low. Nines caught his breath and pulled off his mask, yanking the fragment of the blade from his shoulder it had stuck in his chassis but hadn't pierced it, and cradling his still throbbing, still burning arm. He slumped against the dirty brick wall and curled into a ball, trying to massage the pain out of his arm and plucking out any errant worms still stuck to him. His flesh felt tender, almost spongy under his touch. The muscles were tearing away from his chassis and drifting unmoored beneath his skin, literally coming apart at the seams. The rest of his body ached, too, and he wondered if his legs might be the next parts to go. If so, the Royal Guard wouldn't need to work very hard to catch up with him. He hacked into himself, deadening the pain receptors in his right side to dull the pain and disabling the motor systems in his arm so he wouldn't accidentally put them under any further strain. Oh, man, Nines, you fucked up bad, he thought. If you were still around, you'd scold me and call me an idiot. But then we'd limp back to safety, and when we were out of harm's way you'd hug me and tell me you were glad I was safe. That's how it'd go, if it was the two of us. If you were still around. One lonely night, in an attempt to comfort him, Toriel had told Nines a story about a princess who had once been cursed to fall into a deep sleep. The princess had remained in such a state for 100 years before true love's kiss had awakened her at long last. Although he'd felt a little silly, Nines had given it a try, waiting until everybody was asleep before creeping into the bedroom, brushing the hair out of 2B's eyes, so the first thing she saw if she awoke would be her brother and not her own bangs, whispering, "I love you, 2B," into her ear just for good measure, and laying a soft, gentle kiss on her lips. Nothing had happened. Maybe true love only referred to romantic love. Maybe the love a boy had for his sister just wasn't true enough. Or maybe it had just been an asinine, insipid story for children. "Pod," he said, his voice hoarse, his throat tight and scratchy, "search for and play back a recording of 2B's voice." Statement: search results indicate the presence of 1,502 results within audio mission records. Proposal: narrow search terms. Find. Nines took a deep breath. "A few months ago, I said to her, I can really be an idiot sometimes. And then she said." Searching. Pod 153 waited a few seconds. Record found. Beginning playback. "Yes," 2B said, her voice stern, but soft, reproduced with almost perfect fidelity by Pod 153, "but you're my idiot." Nines had felt his black box grow hot in his chest when she'd said it. She'd acted like she hadn't said anything afterward, just an awkward slip of the tongue from a woman who still couldn't bear to admit how much she loved him, who'd still shouldered the burden of her misdeeds on her own, but Nines could never forget that moment. His chest contracting, his throat tightening, hot tears welling up in his eyes, Nines buried his face in his sleeve. End playback. Pod 153 said, its normal voice restored. Play it again. Inadvisable. The psychological effect of this recording seems to have the opposite of its intended effect. Proposal: seek out Dr. Alphys for emergency repairs. Play it. "I want to feel like she's still here." He could barely stop shaking. "Please, just. A pair of cold mechanical arms wrapped around 9S's waist as Pod 153 pressed against his chest. Emotional instability detected. Implementing regulatory procedures. Statement: there. Oh, geez. Nines curled up and wrapped his own arm around the pod in turn, hardly able to breathe, let alone speak, as he cradled its hard, sleek black hull. This was what he was now, so fucked up he needed his pod to give him hugs. Incoming transmission from Pod 042. Nines swallowed the lump in his throat and squeezed his eyes shut, fearing the worst. "This is it." She finally shut down. "I'm sorry, Alphys, and I couldn't fix you properly, 2B. I'm sorry I got you into this mess. I hope I'll see you again soon. Wherever you are." If he had to make his last stand here, then he would make it here and take as many of Chara's goons down with him as he could, and even Chara himself if he could. And he would hope that wherever he went when he died, he would find 2B's spirit and they could stay by each other's sides forever. But if this really was his last day, he wished he could spend it at 2B's side. "Unit 2B has successfully rebooted," said Pod 153, and is now fully conscious. Nines seethed. "Those bastards. I'll make them all pay." 9S's ears caught up with his mouth. What?" he asked. Repeating message: Unit 2B has successfully rebooted and is now fully conscious. Well, don't just. Nines wormed his way free of Pod 153's grip, his black box hot and fluttering in his chest as he leaped to his feet. Open up a communications channel." Pod 153 lifted itself up, hovering at eye level. Connecting. Nines couldn't believe it. He was almost afraid to feel happy. But 2B was back. She was back. Just when he'd given up hope, just when he'd lost his faith. Message forwarded from Pod 042. Unit 2B is currently occupied. Proposal: leave a message. Occupied. Nines felt like somebody was playing ping pong in his chest, back and forth, back and forth. Was 2B okay or wasn't she? Statement: Unit 2B's attention is currently being monopolized by Operator 60 and Pod 042 has explicit orders not to disturb them. Pod 042 will relay any message from Unit 9's at the earliest opportunity. Proposal: leave. All right. 9 snapped, feeling just a little jealous that 60 got to be the first person to see 2B up and about. Start recording. Oh, God, Recording initiated. 9s took a deep breath. 2B, What would he say? What could he say? He'd been so sure he would never see 2B again that he'd been willing to throw his life away. He was. I'm a fucking dumbass, 2B. I'm on my way home right now. Don't worry about me. I'll see you soon, and he was going to cry again. Weird how every emotion could make you cry in just a little different way if you felt it strongly enough. He'd started to think he would never be happy again, but here he was. 9s let the tears fall as he blubbered out the rest of his message. And, 2B, I love you so much. I'm so glad you're okay. I love you. I love you and I'm sorry why you know what, let's save all that shit for later. I'm coming home, 2B, so just sit tight and see ya soon. Wiping away his tears, 9s felt almost giddy as he left the alley. 2B was back, and he was going to see her again soon. All he had to do was make it home in one piece, not hard if he was quick on his feet and didn't overexert himself, and then he heard the sharp sound of a bladed weapon cutting through the air just a second too late, a slender javelin with ridged barbs on its blade cut through his calf and shin, burying its tip in the concrete. 9s struggled to remain upright as a lingering jolt shot through his leg and glanced over his shoulder. A long chain trailed from the end of the javelin up to the same red-cloaked Royal Guard thug he'd run into in the stairwell. The crowds readily parted around 9s and his mysterious pursuer. 9s reached for the javelin and pulled it out of the ground, trying to slide it out of his leg, but the barbs on its blade dug painfully into his flesh. Sure did a number on my boys, android. The attacker lowered their hood and flung aside their cloak, revealing beneath it a snake woman with iridescent scales wearing a heavily modified suit of Yoarha armor, sans sleeves, for some reason, letting scaly, lithe arms glisten in the streetlights. A black blindfold was wrapped over her eyes like a parody of a Yoarha visor. Her forked tongue flicked in and out of her mouth as a long, muscular tail undulated behind her, and with an artful flourish, she bowed. Lieutenant Snacka of the Royal Guard. I've been looking forward to meeting you, 9S. 9 snapped the javelin in two, allowing him to grab the end with the barbed blade and yank it out of his leg from the other direction. Blood soaked his pant leg as the tunneling wound bled freely, but at least now he wasn't pinned down. Self-preservation instincts overcoming the dregs of his last combat high, 9s booked it, ordering Pod 153 to lay down, suppressing fire behind him as he ran. But Snacka closed the distance between the two of them with astonishing speed and coiled a limber, snake-like arm around his neck, choking him. 9s felt his trachea close and struggled to breathe, stale, hot air building up in his chest as his organs tried in vain to vent waste heat through his lungs. Pod 153 floated nearby, wringing its claws in vain. At such close quarters, it couldn't target Snacka without putting 9S's own safety in jeopardy, and with Snacka's flexible arm choking him, 9s couldn't issue any commands to it. Snacka's other arm curled around 9's, the curved, fang-like talons capping her fingers, framing a gaping pink mouth set into the palm of her scaly hand and dripping with venom. The hand, like the head of a cobra, reared back, letting 9s get a good look at its gaping gullet as it prepared to strike. 9s braced himself as best he could. Even if this snake had real venom in those fang talons, it couldn't actually do anything to him, could it? Then again, some organic substances were said to have weird effects on android physiology. He'd once heard a rumor that if an android ate any part of a mackerel, for example, some unique chemical in the fish's flesh would immediately congeal all of the blood in their body and kill them within minutes. The one thing that would be for certain was that this would fucking hurt. This, Snacka hissed, her forked tongue tickling his earlobe, is for Jim and all the other patriots you've murdered. She plunged her talons into 9S's left arm, letting blood gush from the thick puncture wounds in his forearm. As error messages flickered across his HUD, 9s stared at the bleeding holes in his arm, dumbfounded, a haze engulfing his mind that deadened the pain to a dull throb. The blood and coolant running from his wounds began to bubble and fizz, whipping itself into an almost pinkish froth as it trickled down his arm. In spite of himself, in spite of the muscular coils crushing his windpipe, Nines almost giggled. His blood was fizzing up like a can of soda someone had shaken up. And all the pain was fading away and he felt good, somehow, soft and warm and cozy and good as his eyelids grew heavier and his vision grew fuzzier and grayer and his legs began to wobble beneath him. He felt like he could fall asleep right here. 2B. I have to get back to 2B. But, just a little nap first, might be nice. It's almost my bedtime, anyway. Before his eyes fell completely closed and his systems overloaded, but in such a soft and fuzzy way, Nines glanced to the side and thought he saw, mingled in the crowd, a familiar flash of red hair and blue scales. His spirits lifted even as he sank into unconsciousness. Undyne. Did you come here to save me? Chapter 42, E-Weight of the World. Nothing calmed Undyne's nerves quite like piping hot CT, although people gave her weird looks when they saw her putting the normally chilled drink in the microwave and nuking it to her preferred temperature. A glass of slightly luminescent filtered marsh water, flavored and garnished with mint, was the signature drink of Waterfall, and with a steaming mug of the stuff clutched in her hands, Undyne finally safe. Jerson bit into a crab apple, his beak cutting a neat wedge out of the tiny, sour fruit. You're giving me a weird look here, Undyne. He squinted at her. Looks like there's a lot on your mind. And it's not something you can tell your girlfriend. Yeah, Alphys has enough on her plate, Undyne admitted. She's anxious enough about her own problems, I don't want to throw mine on top of all that. Jerson nodded. Well, Grasshopper, what's wrong? Undyne tried to collect her thoughts, taking another gulp of boiling tea and letting it scald her gullet. Ugh. For years, Captain of the Royal Guard had been Undyne's dream job. Now it was a waking nightmare. She stepped into the throne room as always, half expecting to still see Ascari there watering his flowers or taking a tea break in the corner, and as she crossed the threshold, felt a chill run up her spine as her chest contracted around her heart and lungs. Chara Dreamer lounged on the throne, one leg casually crossed over the other, their jeweled black sword resting in their lap. As always, a surprisingly modest tiara encircled their head. Ascari's crown was too big to fit their human-sized head, and a floral eye patch that looked like it had been plucked from Ascari's own garden covered the grievous burn that had taken their right eye. Undyne had heard jokes about people wanting to murder their own bosses her whole life, but had never understood them until now. Since the day Chara had struck down Ascari, she'd had half a mind to quit, and another half a mind to murder Chara on the spot, and those two halves warred with each other every time she looked them in their stupid, smarmy face, but both of her go-to solutions presented a whole host of problems she was doing her best to keep in mind. 1. If Undyne left the Royal Guard, whoever moved up to fill her position might actually do their job the way Chara wanted it done instead of the way it was supposed to be done, and if Undyne wanted to keep her friends safe, if she wanted to keep this kingdom from transforming into something nauseating, something she wouldn't recognize as home, that couldn't happen. 2. Chara was fucking terrifying. Their host of magical swords notwithstanding, sometimes Undyne wondered if maybe they had taken Ascari's soul for a power boost, because something radiated off of them that made Undyne, despite herself, want to run away as fast as she could. It was something that made her feel sick and weak and powerless and not herself. Well, Captain, Chara cleared their throat. Do you know why I've called you here? Undyne felt her spirits sink. After what she had done on the day of Chara's coronation. The day Ascari was murdered. Chara had every reason to fire her, execute her, even. Had they finally brought her here to do that to her? Fire you, they had asked her, the day after their coronation when they had called her to the throne room for the first time. Why on earth would I fire the strongest and most capable captain the Royal Guard has ever had? No, sir, she answered. By royal decree, the possession of a Yorha black box is a crime. Chara lazily picked at their fingernails. As I understand it, none of the people in this kingdom charged with that crime have been apprehended as of yet. Look, those things could be anywhere in the kingdom. Doing a thorough sweep takes time. And you have had time. Chara stood up, their royal robes, violet with ornate gold trimming, swirling around their thin body. World enough and time, Undyne. They stepped down from the throne. I gave you an opportunity one thought was quite magnanimous, especially given your previous insubordination and your, I can't help but suspect, loyalty to the ancien regime. Retrieve just one black box, not even all three of them, and I would let you take the 7 souls and destroy the barrier. I would let you become the god of the new world. But it feels to me like you're dragging your feet. Don't you even want freedom? Of course she did. No one wanted to be stuck down here forever. But killing good people just to escape wasn't something Undyne could stomach. How dare Chara needle her over that like this? But why was Chara giving her this opportunity? What was in it for them? We're doing our best, Undyne insisted. A flat-out lie. It was all she could do to not spit it out at them like a curse. I'll retrieve a black box from your disemboweled chest cavity, she raged in her head. She just needed to find out where Chara was hiding the other 6, then she'd kill them in their sleep and rip out that black heart of theirs. Undyne? You all right, kiddo? At the sound of Jersen's voice, Undyne felt her composure return to her. Closing her eye and taking a deep breath to calm her nerves, she forced herself to focus on where she was. As if it wasn't bad enough having nightmares at night, now she had them during the day. The back of Jersen's little shop in Waterfall was a safe space. It always had been. Undyne still remembered being 10 years old, standing in this very room, the warped and waterlogged wooden floorboards salvaged from a sunken human ship, or so the legends said, creaking as she excitedly rocked back and forth on the balls of her feet and awaited her first day of hero training. She tried to focus on those days. This was a place where she was supposed to feel like she could do anything. Yeah, Undyne muttered. I'm fine. It's about work, I bet, Jersen guessed. New boss must be a real pain, I'd imagine. He let out a wheezing, bitter laugh. Undyne could only sigh. Sorry. Didn't mean to make light of this. Jersen took a sip of his tea. You know, I'm surprised you haven't quit. Me too, Undyne wanted to say. Someone's gotta keep the Royal Guard honest, she replied. Honest, eh? Jersen shrugged. Pretty noble of you. Yeah, she said. Undyne had a lot of pride wrapped up in the Guard. She couldn't stop Chara right now, but she could keep a leash on the people in her ranks who supported them. She wouldn't let the Royal Guard she had idolized, the Royal Guard she had clawed her way to the top of through sheer grit, turn into a bunch of thugs at the beck and call of a megalomaniac. No matter what Chara did, no matter how zealously this kingdom took to their twisted ideals, she'd keep its soul intact so that when Chara's reign came to an end, soon, things could go back to normal. Your best needs to be better. Undyne, Chara stepped down from the throne, their footfalls echoing through the silent hall of the throne room. I need you to understand the gravity of our situation. The human race is long extinct. Now even Yoarha is destroyed, and with it, every android who possesses a black box, save for our little fugitives. Do you realize that, Undyne? That's, she knew about the logic virus from 6.0, but surely if 6.0 and 13b Chara had been spared its ravages, there could have been others. You don't know that for sure. We can't just wait until someone who deserves to die falls down here, Undyne. That was what Father wanted to do, and his reluctance would be our downfall. Chara sighed. I know it must be hard for you. I know 2B and 9s were your friends. But this is our last chance. If we do nothing, our race will outgrow our prison and suffocate to death within a generation. We hold the weight of the world on our shoulders, and it's a burden we can't afford to cast aside. Chara stepped closer, close enough for Undyne to punch them if she wasn't rooted to the spot. Or is the looming extinction of monster kind not enough incentive, Undyne? They asked, a quiet fury building up in their voice. Are you not concerned that our kingdom will die in darkness? Do you need the stakes to be more personal? That's not. What would the children think, Undyne, the ones who follow you around and cheer for you, if you were stripped of your rank and ejected from the Royal Guard? Or is there something else you'd rather lose? Or someone else? You bastard! Undyne wanted to shout. It was bad enough that Chara could threaten her job or her life if she were pressed to give those up for a noble cause, she could. Papyrus, though? Alphys? Undyne knew she wasn't the only one being pressured like this. Alphys wanted to resign as royal scientist, but Chara had threatened to prosecute Undine for her actions on the day of Chara's coronation if she did. The poor girl couldn't sleep, could barely eat, and her scales were losing their luster under that kind of stress. If Chara was using Alphys to threaten Undine now, well, wasn't that poetic? Undine wasn't sure she was being honest with Jerson, or with herself. The truth was there were a lot of different parts of her tugging in different directions. She wanted to stay in the Royal Guard because if she didn't, who knew what hell someone like Snaka could unleash if she was bumped up to fill Undine's position. She wanted to stay in the Royal Guard because kids looked up to her and she didn't want to betray them and break their hearts. She wanted to stay in the Royal Guard because she'd paid with blood, sweat, and tears to get that position and she wasn't going to let some scrawny usurper force her to give it up. She wanted to stay in the Royal Guard because it gave her the opportunity to guide its investigations away from her friends and keep them safe. She wanted to stay in the Royal Guard because it kept her close to Chara, so she would finally be able to kill the shit out of them when the time came. She wanted to stay in the Royal Guard because she wanted to have a hand in freeing her people, saving her people. She wanted to stay in the Royal Guard because she was altruistic, because she was selfish, because she was prideful, because she wanted the glory, because she wanted to be a hero, because she wanted to save her kingdom, because she wanted to save her friends. But she couldn't be all those things at once anymore. She couldn't do what was best for everybody and what was best for herself at the same time. She couldn't save her kingdom from its encroaching extinction and save her friends at the same time. And it was tearing her apart, eating away at the core of herself just as surely as Chara's piercing scarlet glare did. Holding her tongue and swallowing her rage as Chara threatened her loved ones, trying not to glare at Chara and clench her fists so hard they bled, was the hardest thing Undine had ever had to do. Yet still, something slipped out. After what you did to Ascari, how dare you take the moral high? Chara stepped back, crossing their arms and raising an eyebrow as Undine struggled to tame her tongue and contain herself. No, Undine. By all means, finish that sentence. Undine bowed her head. No, sir. I'm sorry, sir. Chara reached out and laid a hand on Undine's shoulder. You have to believe, Undine, that I didn't want to kill father. Their voice had dropped to a tender whisper. If it had been up to me, he would be spending his retirement in a lovely garden right now. But he forced my hand. You chose to kill him, bastard, and everybody knows it. Undine shook her head. She could feel the ache in her chest growing stronger and harder to ignore, the way it always did whenever someone brought up Ascari. You have to understand. Ascari would have let his own people rot to spare his guilty conscience, Chara insisted. He never had any intention of following through on his plans and you were all going to burn for it. He couldn't face the truth and do what needed to be done. That's not true, Undine brushed Chara's hand off her shoulder none too gently, betraying her true feelings. Ascari would have. If he'd wanted to free you, he could have taken one of the black boxes he'd collected at any time and harvested the rest from the surface, then broken the barrier. He could have freed you all 200 years ago if he'd wanted to. A single tear dripped down Chara's cheek, even as their fist trembled at their side. I loved him dearly, Undine, believe me, they choked, their emotional display seeming almost genuine, but he betrayed his people, he betrayed you, and I couldn't forgive him for that. Undine recoiled, as if Chara's words had wounded her. There had to be a good reason for Ascari's inaction. He couldn't have been so cruel. That wasn't the Ascari Undine knew. She couldn't believe he'd just lie to his kingdom, to his people, to her like that. Undine. Captain Undine, Chara leaned in, wrapping Undine up in a tender embrace, and laid a hand on her cheek. Undine could feel her breath freeze in her lungs as icy tendrils of fear wrapped around her heart. She tried to quell it. She was Undine, damn it, the strongest monster in the kingdom. She couldn't let this murderous usurper give her a panic attack. She was supposed to be better than that. What would 2B think of her if she could see her like this? What would anyone think of her? I need you, Chara said, to be the hero this kingdom needs. The hero this kingdom deserves. Chara leaned in closer, the petals of the flower covering the burned and scarred part of their face where their right eye had once been tickling Undine's cheek. Prove to me, they whispered in her fin, that you will make a beautiful god. Undine wanted to free her people. She wanted to free her people. But she thought she'd known what heartbreak felt like before. She knew now. That feeling you got in your chest when a girl you'd been dating for months decided not to show up for dinner without even texting you and left you waiting in front of a basket of breadsticks all by your lonesome was nothing compared to facing the slow collapse of everything you believed in. All she'd ever wanted to do was beat up the bad guys and protect the good guys. Why were things so complicated now? Why couldn't things be simple, the way they'd been before Undyne had ever met 2B and Nines? Why did they have to be the root of her problems, when they were all such good friends? And why? Why would Ascari? How could Ascari? So, you need my advice? Or just a shriveled old shoulder to cry on? Jerson asked, sliding a box of tissues across the table. I'm always here for my star pupil. Undyne grabbed a fistful of tissues and scrubbed away her tears. I guess. I want to talk to someone who knew Dad. She struggled to force out the words they caught in her throat. Chara says so many horrible things about him. Things I can't believe. That couldn't be true. But their followers just repeat them like they're the gospel truth. It's not fair. Well, I don't know how much of what that little shit's been saying was true. But Ascari was a complicated guy. It's easy to see why people might think less of him if they don't know him well. Jerson took a long, slurping sip of his tea, emptying the glass and leaving cloudy ice cubes to clink together like dice. After we'd hollowed out the mountain and built up home, he took me aside and admitted that it would be too dangerous for us to leave. The humans would just slaughter us if we did. I agreed with him. It took a pretty brave man to admit that we had to stay in our prison if we wanted to survive. Undyne reeled. So Chara was telling the truth? That Ascari never intended to free us? Her fingernails dug into the table. It took a brave man to keep us locked away in here? He wanted to protect us from humans, but... Jerson fidgeted, tucking his neck a bit into his shell. But then, after his kids died, he changed, announced the whole war on humans bit, got all fire and fury. You should have heard the speech. Rise, my people. Take your sorrow and turn it into anger. Our kingdom thirsts for the strength of its people. Glory to monster kind. The old queen wasn't the only person who thought he was being a damn fool for that, Jerson admitted. I felt a little betrayed, too, to be honest. It felt like a desecration of Asriel and Chara's memories. Lost my faith in the man, ended up resigning on the spot. But was he lying all along? Undyne shouted out, not realizing until the words had left her mouth and rung through the humble shack that she had shouted them. Simmer down, kid. Jerson shrugged and sighed. Truth is, I don't know. These eyes can see the flaws in a gemstone, but not what's in people's hearts, and, really, I don't know if I knew Ascari's heart as well as I thought I did. I like to think he came to his senses in the end. Remembered who he used to be, where his loyalties were. Not to monsters or humans, there's more to the world than that. Undyne felt as though she'd been socked in the gut. To think that all this time, the only person who seemed to really want to break the barrier was Chara, her sworn enemy, the killer of the man who had loved her like a daughter. She couldn't stop crying. She emptied Jerson's box of tissues and it still wasn't enough. All she could do was just sit there blubbering. Whoa, hey, Undyne kiddo, you all right? I don't understand, Ascari. I don't understand anything anymore. I don't understand Jerson, I don't understand you, I don't even understand me. Jerson slid off his chair and circled the table, taking to Undyne's side, wrapping leathery claws around her hand. It's gonna turn out okay, kiddo. That girl Ascari handed over to you before the duel, she all right? Undyne wiped her eye on her sleeve. Yeah. Good. You make sure she's okay, okay? As long as you and her stick around, old Gory ain't gone from this world. Undyne nodded. Her final order from Ascari. As long as she followed it, a part of Ascari would live on. You know. I knew Chara, too. And Prince Asriel, I was his godfather. They hung out a lot here in Waterfall, actually. Bunch of troublemakers. Royal pains in the ass, you know. A grin cut across Jerson's beak. Honest, I've been keepin' a lower profile since Chara's coronation, just in case they see me and remember the spanking I gave when I found the brat trying to steal a bunch of old weapons from the Royal Guard's armory. He burst out laughing. That kid and their swords. Obsessed with M. Gave M weird names and everything. Jerson shivered. Creep. That kid and their swords. Chara let Undyne go and turned around, walking back toward their throne. That is all. You are dismissed. I wish you happy hunting. Undyne caught her breath. Wait, sir. Chara paused. Yes. Let's say I fail. Let's say I try to apprehend one of the androids and we end up killing each other. Well, Chara admitted, stroking their chin thoughtfully, 2B and 9s can be quite lethal adversaries. You can't just let any monster absorb the souls. Most of them couldn't handle the determination. Of course, you would be familiar with Alphys research, wouldn't you? Chara glanced over their right shoulder, remembered they couldn't see out of that eye, and turned around to face Undyne. Yes, it's true. A monster of royal blood or someone like you, who worked so hard to attain the same heights of magical power would have to absorb the souls. And monsters like you are a rare breed. What would I do if I didn't have you? At last, Undyne understood why Chara had spared her. Why they continued to allow her to serve as captain of the Royal Guard. Gotcha. I'm too valuable for you to threaten, you fucking bastard. Try hurting Alphys or Papyrus if I don't obey, I dare you. And try hurting me if Alphys hands in her resignation. We'll wipe that smug grin off your face just like Ascari wiped off your eye. Chara brandished their black sword. This, they said, is Morning Star, also known to some as Wormwood. When it grows sufficiently hungry, it can absorb the souls of its foes. If a living host for Godhead is unavailable, this sword will do just fine. They gave the sword a few experimental swishes through the air, letting the giant fire opal at the base of its blade catch the light and sparkle with dazzling colors. In many ways, a sword would be the ideal god. It does whatever you command without the slightest hesitation or protest. It never complains about your will, merely follows it. Perfectly. Oh, yeah? So why not just use morning wood or whatever in the first place? Chara sheathed the blade. They closed their eyes and took a deep breath. Would much rather have a carrot compelling me to greatness than a stick punishing me for insubordination, wouldn't you, Captain Undyne? Yes, sir. Of course. Undyne made a perfunctory bow and retreated from the throne room as quickly as she could. She wouldn't realize it until long after she had exited the castle, but she didn't take in a single breath until she had returned to the bustling streets of New Home and headed off for Hotland. Her hands were shaking, her breath was short, and by the time she reached Alphys' home to convalesce, her scales glittered with a sheen of sweat that had not come from the oppressive heat and humidity of Hotland alone. The castle that had once been like a second home to her was now a prison. Sards with weird names, Undyne took another sip of tea to calm herself down. Does Morning Star ring a bell? Morning Star. Morning Star, Jerson mumbled, tapping on his forehead. Sounds familiar. Describe it to me. Chara's got it. It's black. Kinda short. Big fiery jewel at the base of the blade. Jerson clapped his hands, the sound reverberating through his tiny abode. I thought that trinket looked familiar. Undyne stood up, gripping the table. You know it. Know it? I know the guy who forged it. Jerson answered, a strain of enthusiasm in his voice like a strain of rare jewels running through common earth as his scaly, leathery, wrinkly neck rose out of his shell. Well, knew he died during the war, but yes. That thing, Jerson said, growing increasingly animated as he indulged in his archaeological passions. He always got so excited about treasure hunting, was supposed to be the ultimate weapon. And that was they were just calling it that for show, right? Undyne asked. As if that magic god super sword Chara had used to put 2B in that coma wasn't bad enough. Nope, it was supposed to be the real deal. Jerson's tone changed from whimsical to morose. King Telgor Dreamer commissioned it during his reign when the hostilities between humans and monsters began to rise. But when war finally broke out, Ascari was king, and he forbade the sword's use. When we lost the war, it was lost to the surface. Why didn't he let anyone use it? Another example of Ascari being too soft to do what it took? No, she couldn't think like that. That was how Chara thought, and she couldn't let them poison her against. Do you know how Ascari claimed the throne from his father? Jerson asked. Undine shook her head. Of course. Ancient history. Well, King Telgor was a hothead, a warmonger. He knew a war was brewing, and he wanted to be the one to start it. So he had a contingent of the Royal Guard capture a family of humans who'd built a home in neutral territory and bring them to him. He killed them one by one with the Morning Star, personally, and took their souls. The idea behind the sword was that once it had taken the souls, anyone could wield it and command that power, king or commoner. But Telgor took the sword, admiring the glow from the 5 souls imprisoned within its eye as he wrapped his paw around the hilt. Jerson's leathery beak wrinkled into a bitter, sardonic grin. And he died. Instantly. Big, 8-foot wall of solid muscle 1 second, a 6-inch pile of salt the next. The souls the sword absorbed vanished into who knows where, maybe the sword ate or something. Turned out, wielding that thing still took a kind of strength the old battle axe just didn't have. There it was. At last, Undine understood everything perfectly. So that's why Chara's saving that sword is a last resort. That's why they're trying to groom me into being their god. They know that if they use the sword and it kills them, we'll be back at square one and our people will be doomed. That means I have to find out what they did with the other 6 souls and take them for myself. Or else I'll have to. Magic swords. Pretty to look at, but never trust 'em, Jerson scoffed, fiddling with a jeweled ring on his scaly, wrinkled finger. If King Chara the Magnificent keeps playing with that stuff, well, who knows? Maybe you'll have a new boss soon enough. Undine let out a nervous laugh. Say, ain't the captain of the Royal Guard next in the line of succession? Considering, you know. Queen Toriel and Prince Asriel are long gone. Jerson chuckled, wiggling his eyebrows. There's a certain joy, Undine, in being your own boss. Undine felt her phone buzz in her pocket. Excuse me? She fumbled with the phone and checked her recent messages. A couple of texts from Alphys, mostly frustrated emoji spam. Undine wasn't the only one whose government job had gotten a lot tougher in the past month, and a few selfies from Papyrus, and an update from the Royal Guard. Fugitive sighted in Hotland. Positive ID is Nines. Undine sighed. Damn it, Nines, you don't know what low profile means, do you? Then again, it wasn't like she was one to talk, considering how naturally grandstanding had always come to her. That was the second worst thing about this whole situation. She had to be all clandestine. It sucked. All right, Undine. Think tactical. How can you get them off his back without getting them off his back? She sent the guards her commands. Follow at a distance, but do not engage. Fugitive is definitely armed and dangerous. There you go, Nines, she thought. Don't say I don't stick my neck out for you, kid. Now she had to catch up with whatever team was going after him and find some way to let him slip through their fingers with. What was that phrase Alphys kept using again? Right. Plausible deniability. Undine stood up, shoving her phone back into her pocket. Thanks for the tea, Jerson. Always a pleasure to have ya, kiddo. Jerson reached out and gave her a hug. He barely came up to her chest. Ah, I remember when you were as tall as me. Time really does fly when you're an old coot. Take it slow while you can, and, he gave her a comforting squeeze, sending a little jolt of warmth through Undine's heart. Stop by whenever, ya hear? She patted his head in return. Will do, sensei. As Undine left Jerson's humble abode, walking through his cluttered and treasure-laden shop on the way out, Emil was there in his ridiculous little cart and greeted her with the same frozen stone smile as always. She wanted to believe her conscience was clear now, that her resolve was stronger than ever. And she did feel better. A little better. But there was still turmoil in her heart, and her head was still pounding with ebbing and flowing waves of grief and hatred. I won't let Chara break me, she had kept telling herself these last few weeks, but as she struggled to keep her composure on her way to rendezvous with the Royal Guard, she wondered if maybe Chara already had and she was just too proud to admit it yet. Commencing system check. Memory unit, green. Initializing tactics log. Loading geographic data. Vitals, green. Remaining MP, 49%. Black box temperature, normal. Black box internal pressure, normal. Activating IFF. Activating FCS. Initializing pod connection. Launching DBU setup. Activating inertia control system. Activating environmental sensors. Equipment status, green. All systems green. Combat preparations complete _. Although he passed his system checks with surprising ease, consciousness did not come so easily to Nines. His eyelids still felt like lead weights, his eyes burned like someone had filled his tear ducts with battery acid. His mouth felt numb, like it was filled with cotton mouth, that was the name of a snake, and his entire brain seemed to be pulsing against his skull. A friendly face swam in front of him. Brilliant scarlet eyeshadow over a yellow eye. Auburn hair tied back in a thick and unruly ponytail with a shock of snow-white bangs falling over blue scales. Actually, Nines noticed as his vision sharpened and the staticky snow faded away, the face he'd expected to be friendly was anything but. Undine looked haggard, her scaly skin dark and dull and grayish beneath her eye, so bloodshot the yellow sclerae had taken on an orange tint, an eye patch, accentuating gaunt eye sockets and transforming her face into a weary death's head in the low lighting of wherever Nines was. Where was he, anyway? There were bars behind Undine. A prison cell? His arms had been pinned behind his back and a pair of metal cuffs bound his wrists. He was on his knees, Undine was crouching down in front of him. Undine, he croaked, trying to smile. Are you here too? She slapped him across the face. Nines squeezed his eyes shut as Undine's open palm stung his cheek. Ow. What the fuck, Un? She slapped him again. Same hand. Same cheek. More pain. Nines bit his tongue. What am I gonna do with you, Nines? She hissed. For starters, Nines said, swallowing a little bit of his own synthetic blood as he pressed his tongue against the inside of his cheek, you could stop slapping me. I told you not to kill anyone. I made you swear, made you put your hand over your goddamn black box and swear you wouldn't just go around killing people. It was kill or be killed. Nines protested. What about your end of the bargain? You're supposed to keep your stormtroopers in line. Shut up, you moron. Undine dropped her voice to a whisper, her voice quiet but just as furious. You don't think these rooms have cameras and microphones? I just broke my arm and got poisoned. Sorry for not thinking straight. Look, Nines, Undine pressed her hands to her temples and squeezed her eyes shut. I know the Royal Guard is your enemy now, but a lot of the people in it are still my friends. Her mouth was a taut, thin-lipped grimace as she hissed at him through gritted, yellowed teeth. How am I supposed to let you go? You're a cop killer now. You're lucky Lieutenant Snacka even let me throw you in this cell. I had to pull rank and everything, and she looked pissed enough to mutiny right there. You probably won't last another hour in here before somebody drags you out and lynches you. And Chara's breathing down my neck enough as it is if I let you out of here. She buried her face in her hand. Please tell me some good news, Nines. Say you picked up the rest of the black boxes on your scans or something. Nines took a deep breath. No news on the black boxes, he admitted. But 2B just woke up. Undine pulled her hands away from her face, and there was the slightest hint of a smile there now, a little glimmer of brightness in her worn and weary eye, but it soon faded. Bet she's wondering where you are right now. She sighed, her gaze flitting across the cell but refusing to center on Nines. Guess I've got no choice but to spring you out of here, and take my lumps. Nines slowly began to realize just how deeply he'd fucked up. He hadn't just hurt himself. Undine was in a truly unwinnable situation here, and it was all his fault. Undine. I'm sorry, he wanted to say, but it didn't feel like enough for what he'd done. She conjured an electric spear, stray arcs from its shaft drifting close enough to 9SS body to numb his skin, and laid its blade against his cheek as she rose to her feet, the molded lightning of the spearhead sending waves of static and distortion through his visual processor. Well, let's put on a show. There was no friendliness in her voice, just a cold, iron bite. She sounded almost like 2B had back in the bad old days. Nines tried to rise on unsteady feet, still reeling a bit, pins and needles running up his legs. His right arm was still immobile, and his left still felt prickly and weak from Snaka's poisonous bite. Both were bound behind his back, straining his shoulders. The idea that he could possibly even pretend to overpower Undyne in his condition was laughable, but he could probably still make it look convincing if she played along. Undyne snapped her finger and a spear shot up from the floor, catching on his hood and lifting him off his feet. He dangled in the air, the electrical radiance from the spear running up and down his spine and deadening his arm and legs. Okay. Not exactly the show I thought we'd be putting on, but... Undyne punched him in the stomach. Nines felt all the breath vanish from his lungs as his visual display flickered and jumped, and as his back collided with the spear shaft holding him aloft, his handcuffs broke apart under the impact. He wheezed and coughed as the pain sank through his skin, throbbing all the way down to his chassis. As Nines struggled to catch his breath, Undyne cracked her knuckles and laid into him again. "This is for Jim, you murderous bastard." Nines retched and gagged from the blow, spitting out a wad of blood mixed with spit and letting it dribble down his chin. Undyne dispersed the spear holding him in the air and let him collapse on numbed and limp legs that immediately buckled beneath him. Undyne crouched down and took a fistful of 9SS hair, tugging painfully on his scalp as she lifted up his head. "This cell has one loose bar third from the left. You can jiggle it free and slip through the gap. Just wait a few minutes till the coast is clear so we don't run into each other." Nines nodded. "Got your pod in a Faraday cage down the hall," she whispered in his ear. "Weapons, though Snaka took them as trophies. Don't try to get them back, just get out of here before something happens that I can't bail you out of." He nodded again. "Got it." He felt dirty for having to leave behind not only his own swords but 2B's as well. "And, you can rest a bit at Alphys, but don't stay there any longer than an hour," Undyne added. "Jerson or Papyrus could offer you a safe haven for a couple hours, maybe, if you need it, but if you linger anywhere, you're gonna get more people hurt." She let go of Nines and stood up. Clutching at his stomach and gritting his teeth as his sore abdomen protested every movement he made, Nines sat up. "Got it. Undyne, She kicked him, the toe of her boot slamming into his chin and snapping his head back, leaving Nines sprawled on the cold concrete floor. "One more thing," Undyne said, glaring at Nines as she towered over him, her mouth twisting into a bitter scowl. "When you get back to 2B and 60, don't ever poke your head out of the ruins again until this is all over. Stay there and stay out of trouble. And don't ever talk to me again." The words hit Nines like a knife to the gut, almost more painful than the beating Undyne had just handed down to him. "Don't ever," he parroted. "I'm done with you, Nines. You crossed a line today that I can't ever forgive you for." Undyne crossed her arms. "From this point on, if we ever see each other again, it'll be as enemies. I'm having a hard time justifying not killing you right now, in fact." Nines hung his head and looked down at his boots as the weight of Undyne's harsh words rested on his shoulders. "I'm sorry." "Yeah, I bet you are," Undyne scoffed. "I'm letting you go for one reason and only one reason: I don't want to hurt 2B. That's it." Undyne turned her back on Nines, slid the barred door open, walked into the gloomy hallway, and slammed the door shut, leaving Nines alone. Chapter 43, E Out of the Frying Pan, Part I. "And, 2B, I love you so much. I'm so glad you're okay. I love you. I love you and I'm sorry. Why, you know what, let's save all that shit for later. I'm coming home, 2B, so just sit tight and see ya soon." Pod 042 stopped the recording as it followed 2B down the hall. Playback ended. "Would Unit 2B like to replay the message? Why didn't you tell me when he called?" 2B snapped as she pulled a long black greatcoat over the outfit she'd hurriedly thrown together. Unit 2B was with Operator 60. Queen Toriel informed this support unit that it was impolite to interrupt two young adults when they share an intimate moment together. 2B rolled her eyes. "Call him back. Connecting." Message forwarded from Pod 153. "Unit 9 is currently occupied. Proposal, leave a message." Occupied? 2B thought. Has he run into trouble so suddenly? "Where's my sword?" she asked. Response, the virtuous contract is currently registered to Unit 9 SSNFCS. Okay. What about the Joyous? That weapon is also registered to Unit 9 SSNFCS. Both of them, she asked, incredulous. Unit 9's has heavily modified his own systems. Of course, he had. 2B sighed. No weapons here, then she'd just have to procure something to fight with on her way to meet up with 9's. To make matters worse, she couldn't find her visor either, limiting her ability to efficiently receive data from her pod. She felt lucky she still had clothes. Toriel caught up with 2B, concern writ large on her face. Oh. 2B, dear, are you sure you are fit to go out? It is quite late, she said, stifling a yawn as if to prove her point, and after what you have been through, a bit of rest might. I've been resting for the past 47 days, said 2B, ignoring how paradoxically tired she felt as she worked the last bits of the stiffness out of her arms. I'm fine. Well, I suppose that's true, Toriel said, seemingly unconvinced, her kind eyes still giving 2B a skeptical dressing down. Yet, you were very badly injured, damaged when you were brought here, and Unit 2B has experienced a decrease in speed, strength, stamina, and reaction time due to the poor quality of the materials used for repairs, Pod 042 stated, but remains within accepted parameters for a Type E model. Unit 2B is combat ready. Pod 042 was, of course, blunt as ever, not willing to mince words. 2B had to admit, hearing the phrase "the poor quality of the materials used for repairs" put a knot in her stomach and made her feel that she had somehow become weak, defective. 6 words from that horrible night so long ago, that horrible night that had never happened, that horrible night 2B had made unhappen, echoed through her mind, sending a shiver up her spine. Let me erase your defective heart from this world. I'm fine, 2B insisted, more to convince herself than Toriel. It is dangerous out there, Toriel warned 2B. All the more reason to bring 9's home, 2B insisted. He's going to hurt himself. Toriel let out a resigned sigh. So I have told him. Time and time again. I had forgotten how difficult it is to care for a child when he already sees himself as an adult. That, I suppose, is why older sisters like you exist, 2B. 2B understood how one could find Toriel's propensity to see anybody younger than 1,000 years old as a child as irksome. That, compounded by his growing frustration and guilt over 2B's condition, must have been what had driven 9's off. Oh, before I forget, Toriel rushed out of the room and came back with a large bundle inexpertly covered in crumpled scraps of leftover holiday wrapping paper. Dr. Alphys told me to give this to you once you woke up. 2B accepted the unwieldy mass of gift wrap. Once there had been a time when she hadn't cared much for gifts. No one had ever been close enough to her to give one, except of course for 9 seconds, and she had usually repaid his kindness by betraying him to her duty. But things were different now, and she held on to the mysterious package with no anxiety or apprehension. She tore off the wrapping paper, uncovering a sleek black buckler with a long and broad blade slung underneath it. When she affixed the buckler to her forearm, the blade ran parallel to it, tucked under the metal shield. With a simple squeeze of her fist, the blade swung around like an enormous switchblade, its polished metal surface catching and throwing the lamplight bathing the room. Toriel looked crestfallen. Oh. I thought it would be a nice sweater, or something. Although it was a bit too heavy for that, she coughed into her sleeve. A sword is nice, too, I suppose, she muttered, her voice dripping with disapproval. Pod 042 inspected the blade as 2B swung it back into its idle position with another gesture. Analysis: this weapon's design appears to have been inspired by the heat saber included in Yoarha Flight Unit's weapons loadout. However, without a power source, its cutting power is greatly reduced. 2B noticed a bundle of wires tied up and tucked away beneath the long, slim buckler that housed the blade. Perhaps this blade was meant to have a power source, but Alphys hadn't finished it yet. She tested the blade's unfolding mechanism a few more times, making sure to keep the swinging blade clear of anything, or anyone, it could hit by accident. Toriel made sure to keep her distance, eyeing the sword warily. The way the blade responded felt surprisingly responsive for something so analog. Seems I'll be able to take care of myself just fine, 2B said. Toriel cleared her throat. If you are done waving that thing around, she handed 2B an envelope. This came with it. 2B slid her finger along the envelope's edge and pulled out a folded sheet of paper covered with Alfie's cramped, messy handwriting. Hi 2B. This is for you when you wake up. It was inspired by one of my mecha shows. I let Pod 042 download it from my server so you can watch it whenever you want equals or maybe you and Undyne and Nines and Sixo and I can all meet up and watch it together. I know you're not super into cartoons but you'll like this one, I promise. The main character is just like you. Anyway, this is part 1 of the Celestial Being set. I'll have the rest finished by your birthday and I won't spoil anything, so no asking for details. Alphys. 2B refolded the letter and slipped it into the pocket of her coat. Get some sleep. I'll take care of Nines. Toriel gave up and hugged her. Good night, then, dear. I will see you in the morning. And you and Nines had better come home in one piece. If you do not, I. Trust me, 2B answered, grateful that Toriel was being a little bit gentler now with her impassioned hugs and was allowing her to breathe and speak unimpeded. Toriel's strong, yet soft embrace, warm as sunlight and as inviting as a clean bed, was so much easier to bask in when 2B didn't have to worry about her spine breaking. I love you. I love you too, 2B responded, letting go and expecting the queen to do the same. Truth be told, though, if it hadn't been for 9 seconds, 2B would have liked to keep holding on. Time hadn't passed much for her while she'd slept, so of course, she couldn't miss Toriel as much as Toriel had missed her, but all the same, 2B was grateful to see her again. Toriel didn't let go. Just give me a minute, dear, she said. 2B gave her a minute, soon becoming aware of a soft, high-pitched whine that at first she worried was being produced by her own black box before realizing it was coming from Toriel. We'll be back, 2B assured her, knowing all too well Toriel's history with her adopted families leaving her behind. Toriel didn't let go, and 2B began to feel impatient. Hugs could wait. Right now, she had an obligation to fulfill. Excuse me, she finally said, her tone a little sharper than she'd intended. Nines needs my help. Oh. Right. My apologies, Toriel said, finally letting go, planting one last kiss on 2B's forehead before drawing back, a little sheepish smile on her face. But you will owe me quite a hug when you two return. 2B nodded. That's fair. Take care of yourself. With that out of the way, 2B left the house and made her way through the corridor leading to Snowdon, feeling the air grow colder as the warmth from the ruins leaked through the door up ahead. Hey. 2B. She threw up her arms just in time to catch a bundle of fur that shot out from the shadowy end of the corridor and all but leaped into her. 2B. You're awake. Asriel cried out, his maroon eyes wide and bright. Isn't it past your bedtime? No. Asriel buried his snout in her shoulder. 2B, Nines, and I missed you. Besides, I can't sleep. 2B set the boy down, though he kept trying to cling to her. What's wrong? Why were you by the door? Well, Asriel coughed. I have this cough, and I want Mrs. Dr. Alphys to take a look at it, but she's stuck in her lab, and Mom doesn't want me going out, so I was gonna wait for Nines to come back and bring her here. He coughed again. The pods say it's nothing, and Mom says I'll be fine, but I wanna see Alphys. Just to make sure. Neither this unit nor its counterpart has detected any physical faults, Pod 042 said. Hypothesis, Prince Asriel's symptoms are psychosomatic. I am not psycho-automatic. Asriel protested. What if it's a logic virus? Logic viruses don't make you cough, said 2B, reaching out to pat him on the head. They overwrite androids' programming until they become fixated on killing everything around them. How do I know that won't happen to me? Asriel tugged on 2B's coat. 2B started to wonder if Nines had been telling the boy too many stories about the surface. You do not have a logic virus. Infected units have red eyes. Asriel stumbled and let go of her. I have red eyes. The colored part doesn't turn red, 2B hastily clarified. The pupil does. And it's bright. You can see it from 10 meters away in the daylight. Now go to sleep. Well, how am I supposed to sleep now? In a bed. 2B made her way to the stone doorway, braced her shoulder against it, and cracked it open, letting a bitterly cold wind howl through. Logic viruses aren't anything to be afraid of, she assured Asriel. Most are treatable with vaccines, and a good scanner can cure all but the most advanced stages of infection. If you're going to dream about logic viruses, just dream that Nines is there to cure you, too, okay? Does Chara have a logic virus? Asriel asked. 2B froze. I mean, Asriel looked down at his feet. They killed Dad. Why would they do that, if... 2B felt her heart sink. It hadn't even occurred to her that someone might have told Asriel what had happened while she'd been in that coma. But he must have had so many questions when Nines and Sixo had dragged her lifeless, battered body into Toriel's house, and eventually, somebody must have said something. I'm sorry, she mumbled, hanging her head. They loved Dad. Really, they even knitted him a sweater once. They'd never hurt him on purpose, that's not Chara. They hurt Dad on accident once, but it was on accident, and it really messed them up, so. There's gotta be something wrong with them, right? Something you and Nines can fix. 2B didn't know what to say. How could she tell this child 12 years old, older than her by far, and yet so ignorant, so naive, so mentally and psychologically underdeveloped that sometimes even rational people of sound mind did horrible things to people they loved because they found such cruelty to be necessary? They wouldn't. I mean, Asriel buried his face in his paws, his voice cracking. I mean, why you guys never even told Dad I was and I couldn't even. Asriel. Toriel called out, rushing down the hall. What are you doing down here? You ought to have been in bed 15 minutes ago. She scooped the boy up in her arms, despite his protests. It's okay, 2B assured her. He just wanted to see me before I left. Asriel squirmed in his mother's grip. Let go of me, Mom, he groused. He seemed a great deal more rebellious than before. Angry over his father, 2B supposed. Asriel, listen to your mother and go to bed. 2B reached out and tousled his fur. Nines and I will be back when you wake up. With that, Asriel resigned himself to his fate, though he seemed oddly resentful as he muttered something under his breath, and 2B turned around and stepped over the threshold into a kingdom that had changed in her absence. Somewhere, beyond the frozen night-bathed vistas stretched out in front of her, Nines needed her help. She started out at a brisk trot, testing the strength of her legs, and slowly picked up her pace as she grew more confident in her body's capabilities. Her muscles felt a little stiffer than usual, limbs a little heavier, but as Pod 042 had said, her capabilities remained within acceptable levels for a unit of her type. By the time she had exited the forest and begun crossing the ravines and plateaus that lay between her and Snowdon, she was sprinting at almost top speed. Pod 042 kept up with her with ease, as always. This support unit requires additional information to more effectively render support. Proposal: Unit 2B should state her intentions. Find Nines. Rescue if necessary. Pod, scan for 9SS black box signature. No visor meant no HUD meant no map she could pull up, but 2B trusted her pod to guide her with sufficient verbal instructions. Affirmative. Black box signal of reasonable strength detected. Unit 9s is currently located in downtown New Home. That was on the other side of the kingdom. On foot, it would take well over an hour at top speed to go from here to there, and that was assuming 2B didn't run into anything that would force her to slow down or take a detour. Contact Pod 153. Connecting. Pod 042's antenna extended from its hull for a few seconds, then retracted. Connection unsuccessful. Pod 153 may currently be in an area with low bandwidth. This unit will now attempt to connect every 30 seconds until successful. 2B cursed her rotten luck. If she could just get a message to Nines and tell him to lay low and head back home, the two of them could meet each other halfway and she wouldn't have to spend any longer than necessary worrying about him. I can't make it on my own. I can't be strong like you, he'd said. 2B felt a chill run through her body that had nothing to do with the frigid air rushing past her. How dangerous was this kingdom now, if Nines couldn't handle it himself? Incoming transmission. Is it Nines? 2B asked, startled out of her musing. Sender unknown. The signal is encrypted and cannot be triangulated. Then how am I supposed to answer it? 2B asked, slowing just a little bit as a rickety rope bridge swayed beneath her feet. Searching internal memory for available codec. Analysis complete. This message is being transmitted with a standard YORHA encryption protocol. Hypothesis: the message is likely from Dr. Alphys. 2B reached the end of the bridge, setting foot on solid ground as the wooden slats behind her continued to twist and sway and creak. Respond. Affirmative. Pod 042 fell silent, and within a second, Alphys' voice came through in a haze of static. 2B? Is that you? Roger that, Alphys. Amazing. Why Yuri actually I knew you'd wake up sooner or later. I don't half-ass my repairs, you know. You've picked a good time to call, 2B remarked, continuing on her journey through the frosty terrain, the forest rushing past her as she ducked under and weaved around the trees encroaching on the snowy paths. Eventually, the soft amber glow of civilization in the valley below began to come into view. Your pod sent me a message as soon as you woke up. IIVE had it connected to a private server to monitor your condition. Is pod 153 on the server as well? Why yeah, but, not, I can't reach out to it right now. It's, Nines is in trouble, isn't he? 2B slowed her approach as she passed a Royal Guard outpost nestled among the trees, but once it became clear there was nobody on duty there, she picked up her pace. Like you wouldn't believe. I can explain. I'm on my way. What's the situation? He's. There was a burst of static, and another familiar voice broke through. 2B. It's me, 60. I'm connected to Alphys' server, too. 60. Yeah. I've got a small, portable computer terminal here with me, and it's even got a direct visual link to Pod 042. The setup's a little primitive compared to what we had back home, but Alphys and I can keep you up to date on your mission objectives, just like old times. P primitive. Alphys interjected. And nothing I make is primitive. Girls, focus, 2B admonished her two ad hoc support agents. We don't have any time to waste. I'm approaching town now, she said, her boots slipping on the thick snow as she began to half-run, half-slide down the gentle slope of the valley. Snowden quickly came rushing up to meet her as Alphys and 60 filled her in on 9's predicament. Nines had never spent a stint in jail before. To no great surprise, he hated it and wanted to get out as quickly as possible. His first action, once he'd given Undyne a few minutes and decided the coast was clear, was to try and stand up. Easier said than done. His body still ached from the beating Undyne had given him. She hadn't had to punch and kick him for real, had she? The slap had been enough. The puncture wound tunneling through his leg from Snaka's harpoon had started to bleed again. Tearing off a strip from the hem of his coat and rolling up his pant leg, Nines bound the wound as best he could with only one functional hand, his fumbling fingers tying a loose knot. If he strained his ears, he felt he could almost hear the whirring servos in his fingers protest, which didn't instill much confidence in his body's current condition. His right arm, though he'd deadened the pain receptors, still throbbed dully as it dangled at his side, and Nines didn't want to think about what its internal mechanisms looked like right now. How long, again, had he been running around with 2BS Type E protocols governing his body? A week and a half? 2 weeks? More? He couldn't quite remember. Had he been wearing himself thin all this time? All right, Nines, he told himself, limping over to the bars of his cell and tugging on the one Undyne had told him was loose. This shouldn't be too hard. Pull out the bar, find Pod 153, set it to full automatic and tell it to shoot the hell out of anyone who tries to attack me. Sure, Undyne would be mad at him if he mowed down more of her pals, but it wasn't like she could be any more upset with him than she already was. The bar came free in his hand, leaving him just enough room to squeeze into the hallway. He kept the bar in his hand just in case he'd need a weapon in his escape. Nines took a step forward, nearly fell over, and realized that if anybody caught sight of him, he'd be hard-pressed to defend himself, no matter how much makeshift weaponry he had. Couldn't there have been an easier way to spring him out? Maybe he and Undyne could have faked a hostage situation and he could have pretended to use her as a living shield to safeguard his exit. He nearly whacked himself in the head with the metal bar he was holding. Damn it, why hadn't he thought of that 5 minutes ago? No matter. He had to work with what he had right now. And what he had right now was a broken, battered body and a metal rod. Pod 153 is at the end of the hall, Nines reminded himself, and while he still had a chance, he limped down the corridor, passing rows of cells on both sides, some empty, others holding petty crooks slumbering in the corners. The last cell to the right had no bars instead, it was walled off with a fine copper mesh that coated the concrete walls, ceiling, and floor of the room as well. Lying in the center of the walled-off cell amid a pile of assorted electronic junk, likely things confiscated from other prisoners, was 9SS support pod, looking almost forlorn. "Hey," Nines whispered to it. Pod 153. "Can you hear me?" Pod 153 didn't stir. It must have been deactivated, then placed in the Faraday cage for safekeeping. Nines scoured the mesh cage for a doorway and examined the latch. It looked like it took a small key. He could try to find whoever in this jail had the key and steal it from them, which could put him in a lot of danger, or maybe he could whack the latch with a pipe until it broke. Or maybe the metal bar hit the latch with a loud, echoing clang. Nines froze, letting the sharp noise die down as it bounced off the concrete walls. Seconds passed by like hours. At last, Nines heard footsteps from behind. At the other end of the hall, a shadow swung around the corner, forewarning the approach of a curious guard. With any luck, this one would have the key to the cage, and Nines would be able to knock them out and take it. But first, he realized, he had to hide. He glanced around the hall as the footsteps grew louder and the sweeping beam of the guard's flashlight grew brighter, looking for anything he could crouch behind or crawl under. Really? Nines asked himself, his sight falling on a dingy cardboard box just big enough for him to curl up under. Well, any port in a storm, I guess. Snowdon didn't look much different from what 2B remembered. It was still a tiny, cozy town, nestled in the valley between a river and a forest, the eaves of its smattering of squat, wooden buildings creaking under the weight of the snow covering their roofs. 2B could see the Snowdon, one of the largest buildings in town, still lit up, its frosted windows casting warm amber light onto the snow, the library with its erroneous signage, the town square, already festooned with tinsel even though holiday was months away, the riverside harbor, Grilby's pub with its crimson neon sign piercing the night air, Papyrus and Sans house, and even the little cottage 2B and Nines had once called home. Mill, the peaceful Goliath-class machine, towered over the town, currently making use of its stature in the town square to place tinsel and ornaments on a pine tree nearly as tall as it was. This had always been such a welcoming place, but now 2B was here as an intruder, and while the town hadn't changed much, 2B could feel a change in the air suggesting that right now, she did not belong here. "Anything else I should know about?" she asked once Alphys had filled her in on current events including 9SS current incarceration. "Well, forget about taking the boat to Hotland. They'll never let you on," said Alphys. Sorry, but you androids are a kinda persona non grata right now." That wasn't surprising in the least. "So I'll have to go through Waterfall? Why, you should keep a lower profile. Take the tunnels. They're still mostly machine occupied, and while they're officially part of the kingdom, they keep to themselves," Alphys advised. "From there, you can take the waterfall entrance to the laboratory's sub-basement all the way to Hotland." "Never thought I'd be treating machine territory as safe harbor," 2B remarked, reaching level ground and dusting the snow off the hem of her coat before continuing to the edge of town. "I've reached Snowdon." "Okay, now steer clear of the Royal Guard," Alphys said. Undyne's managed to reduce their presence in the outskirts, but the town's crawling with them. 2B had wondered why she hadn't seen anybody on the way here. Undyne seemed to be sabotaging the guard from the inside, not a plan of action 2B expected her to commit to. She slowed her approach and crept into town, keeping herself wreathed in shadow, and clung fast to the wall of the Snowdon as a figure in black armor, a canine monster with thick gray fur spilling over its collar, marched across the street. Familiar black armor. "Yo arha heavy armor?" 2B inquired, dropping her voice to a whisper as she glanced around the corner of the wall. She spared a glance at her boots. The area around the Snowden must have received quite a great deal of foot traffic. The snow was heavily tamped down and her footprints were barely visible. In other parts of town, she'd have to be more careful about leaving a trail. Pod 042 courteously lowered the volume of 2B's support team to prevent anybody from overhearing. Had to, invent some things for Chara, said Alphys. Armor. Weapons. Visors. 2B heard a shrug in her voice. You know. To keep my sea cover. 2B took a closer look and noticed that, in fact, the guard was wearing a black strip of cloth around its eyes. Visors. It's called the revisor system, Alphys explained, unable to prevent a little bit of pride from seeping into her voice. It's linked up to a Sea Central command server to keep all on-duty guards up to date on each other's actions. If one of these G-guys spots you, it won't be long until the whole kingdom knows you're here. So try not to get spotted, 60 suggested. We'll get back in touch when the coast is clear. Got it. 2B nodded, keeping her frustration to herself. Sneaking around wasn't exactly her strong suit. Take care of yourself, 2B. Over and out, said 60. Pod 042 fell silent, but it seemed the lone guard on this street had caught wind of the conversation, if only just barely. Hello, the guard asked, drawing nearer to the Snowden, the snow crunching beneath his boots. Is someone there? 2B froze and pulled away from the corner. The front door to the inn swung open. Yeah, welcome to the night shift, the inn's owner replied. How are the pups doing? Oh, you know, said the guard, dropping his guard. Lou's got fleas. Ram got some salt burns on her paws 'cause she went out without her booties. Say, are there any fresh cinnamon bunnies at the bakery? At this hour, the owner laughed in the guard's face. Check back in the morning, if you're still awake. You take care, officer. The door swung shut. Keeping silent, 2B gently rapped on Pod 042's hull, then motioned to a cottage on the other side of the street. Taking care to stay in the shadows, the pod hovered across the street and knocked loudly on the cottage's wall. The guard's pointy ears perked up. Huh? Who's there? He asked, his voice sharp as he probed in the direction of the sound. With his back to 2B, the guard wandered into the street. But before he could get far, 2B slipped behind him and grabbed him in a chokehold, the edge of her buckler digging into his throat. She kept the pressure on until the guard's struggles ceased and his body went limp. She then dragged the guard's body into the shadows as Pod 042 returned to her side. 2B patted Pod 042. Good work, Pod. Turning her attention to the guard, she unwrapped his visor and held it up. Can you flash the firmware on this and reinstall a proper visor OS? Affirmative. Pod 042 reached out and took the visor in its claws, taking a few seconds to reprogram the nano-machines woven into the cloth. Visor is now registered to Unit 2B. 2B applied the freshly wiped visor, glad to see the familiar elements of her HUD pop up. The resolution of her HUD elements was noticeably lower, but the visor seemed to run the standard OS and connect to her systems without much trouble. Almost as if on cue, a small window opened up to the side of her visual display, Alphys' face visible within. The doctor looked as if she'd seen better days. She was gaunt and weary, gray circles deepening her eyes underneath her thick, round glasses. 2B, I just wanted to remind you of one thing, said Alphys. Try, not to kill anyone. You Undine would be really mad if you. 2B checked the pulse of the guard she'd downed and found it slow, but steady. Why? Alphys chewed on her lip. Because it's, not good to kill people. 2B sighed and made her way through the town, edging around the well-lit town square as multicolored lights bounced soft rays of red and blue off of the falling snow and the tinsel mill was currently draping around the tree. She couldn't help but notice how loud the sound of fresh snow crunching beneath her boots was. I've killed many machines to protect other androids. Was that wrong, too? She asked, irked by Undine's naive request. I'm just saying, a lot of these guys are still Undine's friends. Even though they take orders from the enemy. I mean, they won't once we beat Chara, will they? Alphys replied, nervously adjusting her glasses as they began to slide down her snout. Just, stick to non-lethal takedowns, if you can. please. I'll see what I can do, 2B replied, eyeing the switchblade sword affixed to her forearm. It was most definitely not a weapon designed for non-lethal takedowns. 2B crept closer to the eastern outskirts of town, keeping a close watch on the movements of the several guards stationed at the foggy path leading deeper into the mountain, their bootleg Yoarha armor still visible in the dark mist wrapping around them. She felt an odd, uneasy twinge of déjà vu as she approached, and hoped that she could slip through the guards' blind spots. She wasn't so lucky. Before she could vanish into the mist, one of the 4 guards, an antlered sort of jackrabbit man, noticed her, the searching beam from his flashlight cutting through the air. Reflected light from the pristine snow around 2B's boots sprang up with dazzling brightness as the other guards' lights found her. 2B raised her arm over her brow and squinted as her visual processor automatically polarized and her eyes adjusted to the light, the black silhouettes of 4 guards materializing in front of the light. Each guard drew a weapon. 2B adopted a combat stance. Non-lethal takedowns, huh? She couldn't make any promises, but she'd see what she could do. Nines felt like an incredible idiot as he hid underneath the box and waited with bated breath for the guard to either notice him and get him in trouble or carry on and leave him in peace. The footsteps came closer. Nines felt the complex servos in his chassis softly whine as a bead of sweat dripped down the back of his neck, and irrationally wondered if that would be enough to alert the guard to his presence. Or was he just oversensitive to the sound of the machinery inside him now that the strain had started to break down his body? Or maybe the guard would notice that his cell was empty first. The volume of the guard's footsteps echoing on the drab concrete walls reached a crescendo, then stopped. The guard had stopped. What if they didn't leave? Nines gritted his teeth. Come on, come on. The footsteps started again, this time growing quieter. Now was his chance. Nines stood up, throwing off the overturned cardboard box, and charged at the guard while their back was turned, ramming into them with his shoulder and tackling them to the floor. He dug his knee into the guard's stomach to hold them in place, ripped off their helmet, and drove his left fist into their face with all his might. Unfortunately, this monster's head was a solid hunk of greenish-tinted diamond, so the most Nines managed to accomplish was bloodying his fist. Nines swore under his breath, wringing his hand as his bruised and battered knuckles stung, as the guard writhed beneath him, throwing him off and staggering to their feet. Nines dashed over to where he'd dropped the metal bar as the guard took off in the opposite direction, grabbed the bar, and threw it. The long metal bar spun through the air and cracked against the back of the guard's head before they could reach the end of the corridor, sending them tumbling back to the floor with a spray of jeweled fragments flying through the air. Pausing for just a second to catch his breath, Nines dragged the guard's limp body down the corridor and stripped off the armor, shrugging off his own coat and applying as much of the guard's armor as he could to create what he hoped would be a makeshift disguise. He then searched through the rest of the guard's belongings and found, much to his luck, a ring of keys. Things were finally starting to go his way. The last of the 4 guards fell to the ground, writhing in the snow as he clutched at the bleeding stump where his arm had once been. The armor Alphys had made for these guards, though based on Yoarha heavy armor, was made of inferior materials and lacked much of the durability it ought to have had. 2B's blade had cut through it with little resistance. An ongoing scan by Pod 042 kept tabs on the vital signs of her opponents, showing on her HUD that no life signs had been terminated, although one of the guards was trying their best to play dead. Surrounded by the groans of the wounded, 2B folded her blade into its idle position and brushed the hair from her eyes. "Be thankful I only took your arm," she told the defeated guard as she walked past him. "You won't be so lucky next time. If there is a next time." With that threat hanging in the cold, misty air, 2B continued on her way. 60's voice rang in her ears, frantic. "2B, what are you doing? Now the whole kingdom knows you're here." 2B smiled. "Exactly. Chapter 44, E Out of the Frying Pan, Part 2. Alphys had to say, she enjoyed subterfuge a lot more than she'd expected. Had she gotten a solid 8 hours of sleep just once in the past month? No. Had she eaten solid food at any point in the past 2 days? No. Could she remember the last time she'd polished her scales? No. Did she enjoy being told she had to work for a complete asshole and meet all their demands on the double lest her girlfriend be prosecuted and executed for high treason? Also no. but was secretly designing weaponry for androids and setting up an encrypted server to create a rudimentary support pod network and keep up to date on the statuses of the 3 most wanted fugitives in the kingdom's history while plotting the downfall of her current boss, who had murdered her former boss, the most exciting thing she had ever done. Yes. Sure, she was too nervous to do so much as have a pizza sent over to her lab lest the pizza boy see something he wasn't supposed to see. Sure, her eyes burned every second she spent awake. Sure, she'd fallen hard back into her old habits of letting laundry pile up and not vacuuming and drinking too much coffee and all sorts of other things that held back sleep. But gods, Alphys was living. When she had a passion for something, she threw herself into it 100%, just like Undyne, and right now, resistance was her passion. It wasn't all clandestine work she was doing, though. Every once in a while, whenever Undyne could pull herself away from her own increasingly miserable duties, she and Alphys would take an evening to settle in and watch some cartoons historical records that Alphys had on her server. And since the videos were on the same server connecting the Royal Laboratory to the pods, Sixo could watch along. They even had a little chat room set up so Sixo could join in on the commentary. Sixo was actually a lot of fun to hang out with, and given her circumstances, she really needed people like Alphys and Undyne to spend time with. Surprisingly, she quickly took a liking to Alphys' favorite shows and even totally got why Mew Mew Kissy Cutie 2 was so disappointing compared to the first OVA, which was something Alphys had tried explaining so many times to Undyne to no avail. Tonight, though, was not a cartoon watching night, although Alphys was itching to continue the series they'd started last week. It was a, holy shit, 2BS actually awake now and we need to fill her in on what's been going on while she's been asleep, night. Oh, and also, 2B was going around and very publicly beating up every guard in her path instead of trying to keep a low profile. At least Nines tried to stay stealthy for the first couple hours or so before something inevitably blew his cover. Then again, though, 2B was a combat model. 2B, are all your systems working properly? Sixo asked. On one of the several monitors Alphys had set up, a choppy, low-resolution stream of video from Pod 042 showed 2BS progress from Snowdin to Waterfall. It was nearly unintelligible due to bandwidth issues, but it was clear 2B had disarmed literally another squad of Royal Guards on her way to the deeper tunnels. Like we were saying, it's best if you don't let anyone see you. I'm fully operational, 6-0, 2B replied, a little testily. I know what I'm doing. 2B, maybe you should draw back and run some diagnostics. Alphys glanced at her readings from the revisor system. There were already new orders being transmitted across the kingdom, directing the highest-ranking and strongest members of the Royal Guard to leave their assigned posts and converge on 2BS location. Even now, blips on Alphys' map were starting to filter away from the precinct jail in downtown New Home where Nines had been locked up. Wait a minute, 6-0. It's alright. 2BS she's drawing the guard away from 9S. Now Alphys just had to hope that Undyne and Nines were taking advantage of this situation, and that 2B wouldn't be overwhelmed by the forces she was leading toward herself. Nines fumbled with the keyring, scarcely able to believe his good luck as he matched a tiny copper key to the latch on the Faraday cage holding his pod. His fingers shook with exhaustion as the key slid into the lock and twisted, and with a creak that almost sounded like a relieved sigh, the door to the cage swung open. Pod 153 did not stir, and as Nines approached, he noticed scorch marks, nearly unnoticeable against the pod's black hull and visible only as irregular matte black patches on its glossy surface. As he worked to reactivate it, Nines couldn't help but wonder if Undyne had forcibly shut down the pod by blasting it with lightning and worried that Pod 153's circuitry might have been irrevocably damaged, either limiting its functions or damaging parts of its memory or personality. The thought upset Nines more than he anticipated. Sure, support pods weren't on the same level as androids, but Pod 153 had been with Nines for almost a year now. It was one of his friends. He powered on the pod in safe mode, hacked into it to run a quick diagnostic, and when he didn't see any major damage to any important systems or subsystems, Nines breathed a sigh of relief and brought the pod's higher functions online. Pod 153's hull began to warm up as a soft whirring filled its chassis. Support, Unit 153, is active. Its voice started out slow but quickly picked up speed as the pod's systems returned to normal. Running, data consistency check. Data consistency check complete. Running initial scans. The pod lifted itself into the air, an amber light on its hull blinking. Yorha Unit 9's detected. This support unit is assigned to Unit 9S. Nines couldn't help but smile. Pod 153, welcome back. Pod 153 gave a little nod. This support unit was deactivated before the data cached in its RAM could be saved to internal storage. Short-term data loss has occurred. Proposal: for better and more efficient support, Unit 9s should state his intentions. He patted it on the side, his weary grin widening, and the pod followed him outside the cage. Kman. Let's go home. Affirmative. Nines reached down and picked up the helmet he'd liberated from the guard he'd knocked out. With this armor on, he could probably pass for a guard and slip out unnoticed, although people might ask questions about why Pod 153 was following him around. But just as Nines was about to don the helmet he'd picked up, he got an idea. Pod 153, he addressed his support pod, I want you to shoot out the locks of every occupied cell in this hallway. Affirmative. Pod 153 opened up, revealing its machine guns, and methodically floated down the hall, opening the doors to each cell it found with extreme prejudice. As gunfire echoed across the concrete walls, the prisoners slumbering in their cells quickly awoke, shuffling to their feet. Hi, everyone, Nines said, greeting his groggy fellow prisoners as they clutched at their ears and ear equivalents. First of all, oh, hi, Zizek. Zizek waved at Nines. There were still dried mustard smears all over its blank face. Anyway, we're doing a prison revolt. Nines tossed one of the freed prisoners the ring of keys. Look through whatever's been confiscated here and look for anything that might explode well. I may still be a kind of a Marxist, but I'm very realistic, Zizek spoke up, his robotic monotone somehow sounding disdainful. I don't have these dreams of revolutions around the corner. Then just sit in your cell or something, Nines replied, rolling his eyes. He scanned the hall and picked out one of the escapees in particular, a monster about his height and build that looked a bit like a snail with arms and legs, with banana yellow skin covered in thick mucus. Oh, and you. What's your name? Eskar. Eskar, huh. Nines nodded. What are you in for? Stole a loaf of bread. Poor guy. You were just doing what you had to do to survive, right, Eskar? Not exactly. Eskar looked away, his eyes swaying nervously. I stole it so I could hide a knife in it and, well, you know. Oh, Nines said, a little disappointed. Well, Eskar, mind doing me a solid? Lieutenant Snaka of the Royal Guard kept her office much cleaner than Undine did, which was one reason why Undine had the sneaking suspicion that Snaka wanted her job. To say it was tidy was an understatement. It almost sparkled. Her desk was impeccably neat. All of her paperwork was tidily organized. There was a framed picture of her parents on one side of her desk and a framed picture of King Chara hanging from the wall, where once a framed picture of Ascari had hung, and the glass protecting both was perfectly polished. Undine had a framed picture of Chara in her office as well. When nobody was looking, she threw darts at it. Any inadequacy Undine felt comparing Snaka's neat piles of paperwork to her disorganized mess of an inbox was overshadowed by her firm belief that anyone who spent so much of their time at work tidying up their desk probably wasn't spending enough of their time doing their job. Snaka's office was perfect except for the pile of weapons scattered on the floor at her feet. Snaka had been busy admiring the weapons she'd confiscated from Nines when the first reports of the latest casualties, the loss of Outpost 37 and 36, had reached her. The gilded and shimmering joyous she'd been polishing had fallen from her scaly talons as soon as word had reached her and clattered on the polished floor of her office, soon joined by the spear, greatsword, 2 katanas, and curved saber that fell from her lap as she shot up to her feet in shock. Another android spotted entering Waterfall. Positive identification as. The signal had cut out and the desperate voice on the other end of the radio had vanished, cut short with a panicked scream. But it was instantly obvious to Undine who had cut the transmission. 2B was alive, awake, and tearing through the kingdom on her way to rescue Nines because of course, she was. Undine felt her stomach churn. 2B was the kind of person who'd cut down anything and anyone in her path without the slightest hesitation if Nines was at risk. If 2B left a body count in her wake, how could Undyne cope with that? As Snaka started panicking, banging on the radio and fruitlessly tweaking its dials, Undyne crossed her arms and shifted uncomfortably. Outpost 36. Outpost 36, respond. What's going on? Snaka hissed. The radio squawked back to life with a burst of static, the same unfortunate guard's voice coming through, reedy and nervous. She just tore through us like. How many of you are left? Snaka barked. How many? All of us, but no casualties? Great. Snaka's eyes lit up. Go after her, then. Well, that's the thing, she cut off our arms, ma'am. Both of them. Both of mine, at least. You still have your legs, don't you? Run after her and kick her. Undyne grabbed the speaker from Snaka's hands and held it to her mouth, ignoring the dirty look Snaka shot her. This is Captain Undyne. Who am I talking to? The disarmed guard's tone brightened at the sound of Undyne's voice. Captain. It's PFCP Pines, ma'am. PFC Pines. Undyne racked her brain and quickly paired the name with a face. Pines, a new recruit who'd moved from Snowdon to Waterfall just a few months ago. He could be a little sappy sometimes, but he never let anything needle him. For him to be shaken this much, 2B must have felled him in a matter of seconds, and though she'd spared his life, she probably hadn't been so keen on being gentle with him. Get yourself to a hospital, Pines. You and anyone else who's injured. You're all off duty. Are really, ma'am? Of course. Undyne forced as wide a smile as possible, even though she knew only Snaka could see it. Just take it easy. And don't worry about your arms, someone will pick 'em up for you. Thank you, ma'am. Pines said, sounding much more relieved. Undyne hung up. You're gonna have to work a lot harder on your bedside manner, she told Snaka, if you want to be captain someday. Snaka rolled her eyes. Me? Captain? What under earth could give you that idea, she asked, her voice dripping with faux innocence the same way her talons dripped with venom. Just a hunch. Undyne shrugged, then picked up 2B's white katana, the virtuous contract. A little bit of dust still clung to its ivory blade. Stealing swords now, huh, she asked, changing the subject. Hey, watch it. I liberated those swords. Snaka scowled and grabbed a handful of swords for herself. It's called civil asset forfeiture. And give that one back. Nah. Undyne wiped off the dust and sheathed the virtuous contract in her belt. If 2B really seriously got all this way without actually killing anyone, Undyne would happily turn the sword over to her. If not, well, then it would be Undyne's sword, because the last thing anyone could call 2B would be virtuous. You know the saying, rank has its privileges. Snaka grumbled, but relented, settling for clutching 9SS remaining armaments. All right. Well, let's go take down 2B before she kills someone. Undyne took a deep breath. That was a good plan. If she and Snaka, the two strongest monsters in the kingdom, both headed for 2B, Nines would have a better chance to escape. Damn it, she still felt bad about Nines, even if he was a murderer now, even if it had felt good to drive her fist into his stomach and watch him cough and writhe on the floor. Those big blue eyes of his weren't the eyes of a killer, but the kid had way too much blood and dust on his hands now for Undyne to treat him as anything else. And yet Undyne still couldn't help but feel some pangs of loyalty toward him. But she'd meant what she'd said to him. Nines meant nothing to Undyne now. The only reason she was letting him escape was because she knew what 2B would do if anybody took Nines away from her. As Undyne led Snaka out of the department and onto the streets, a fully armored guard hurried past her, a boxy black machine tucked under their left arm as their right arm dangled uselessly at their side. They walked with a pronounced limp. Snaka noticed these things at the same time Undyne did, and as the guard hurried away, she called out to them. Hey! You! Undyne felt her blood run cold. She knew exactly who this guard was. Maybe Snaka did, too. The guard turned around a little too slowly for Undyne's comfort, stumbling a little. Why yes, ma'am, he asked. The voice that came from under his helmet was obviously 9SS, although he was trying his best to make his voice sound deeper and more gravelly. It would have been funny if Undyne wasn't currently terrified. "Why do you have Unit 9 SS, pod thingy?" Snacka asked. "Oh, this." Nines asked, hefting the pod. Dr. Alphys asked me to bring it to her lab, so she could study and dissect it." "I see." Snacka waved Nines along, and Undyne tried not to breathe a sigh of relief as Nines walked off. "Oh, wait. One more thing." Nines froze. So did Undyne. "Aren't you a little short for a stormtrooper?" Snacka asked. No." Nines shuffled uncomfortably. "Take off your helmet." Nines took off running, and Snacka wasted not even a second as she bolted after him. Undyne found herself lagging behind, for once realizing how exhausted she was. Pouring her heart out to Jerson earlier that evening had somehow been more exhausting than a whole day of intensive workouts, and Undyne could feel her eye burning as if her tears had turned into lemon juice. In spite of herself, she just wanted to curl up and sleep the night away, and she definitely didn't want to be here where she might have to bail Nines out again in what would probably be an extremely suspicious way. Nines stumbled and fell, pod 153 tumbling out of his arms and rolling along the sidewalk as Snacka tackled him. "Gotcha," she hissed triumphantly, ripping off 9SS helmet just as Undyne caught up with her. Undyne and Snacka looked down, both equally dumbfounded, the look of triumph draining from Snacka's face. The man beneath the mask was most definitely not Nines. From the nearest alleyway, Nines poked his head out from behind the corner and, fully aware of his foolishness in doing so, watched Eskar go with the knowledge that his plan was working without a hitch buzzing in his mind like a gentle, friendly bumblebee. All he'd had to do was give the slug his purloined armor, tell him which arm not to use and which leg to limp with, hand him pod 153, and to complete the illusion, hack into the helmet and project his voice from it, and it had all been perfect. As the decoy stumbled and fell, Nines ducked into the alley and took off in the opposite direction to put as much distance between himself and Snacka as he could in the shortest possible time frame given his injuries, the sound of gunfire from pod 153 echoing across the street as it laid down suppressing fire to further impede 9SS pursuers. Off in the distance, a dull boom cut through the air, the ground slightly shaking in the aftermath. And there was distraction number 2. With pod 153 back in action, Alphys now had both pods connected to her server and, at long last, could give 2B some good news about Nines. All she had said upon hearing that Nines had given Undyne and Snacka the slip was, "Good," but even in that one word Alphys had heard the tension melt away from her voice. 6-0, though, had cheered with more than enough enthusiasm to make up for 2B's guarded response. Everything was working out. The Royal Guard presence in New Home was lightning as manpower was diverted to dealing with 2B, with a breakout in one of the small regional jails downtown drawing the heat away from Nines as he made his escape. Alphys let up a deep sigh as she watched the blip on her map from 9SS black box signal draw closer to Hotland. 2B was approaching from the opposite direction with remarkable speed. If all else went well, the two of them would meet up, right here, in Alphys' lab. All the distractions paid off. Soon, Nines left the crowded streets of New Home behind with less difficulty than he'd expected and now stood in the sweltering oven that was Hotland. The entire cavern containing this hellish region of the kingdom throbbed with a red-orange glow from the lakes and rivers of magma, swirling in long, slow eddies around rocky plateaus and sharp spires of obsidian with a speed that made molasses seem fast. Thick pipelines of coolant and fuel with wide platforms cobbled around them linked the islets like bridges and choked the core, the central source of the kingdom's power, like twisting vines as the massive structure hung suspended over the largest of the molten lakes. From his current vantage point at the furthest east side of Hotland, just past the gate leading to New Home, Nines could see, off in the distance, Alphys' laboratory, a familiar white cube of a building sitting atop one of the rocky plateaus near the entrance to Waterfall. His heart leaped, his spirits rising as he felt the heightened whirring of his black box lesson. If he could make it there, he might as well be home free. Alphys could help him with his arm. Or he could just head down to her basement laboratory, far beneath the molten lake, and exit out into the depths of Waterfall. It wouldn't be hard to make it to Snowdon from there, and from Snowdon, home. Home to 2B. He'd see her again. At last, after so long, he would be able to talk to her and she would be able to hear him. At last, after so long, he would be able to hug her and she would be able to hug him back. Pod 153 caught up with Nines as he began his descent down to one of the pipeline bridges below. He made a jump down to one of the rickety platforms he'd normally have been able to handle easily, but when his boots had hit the metal grate straddling the pipes, he'd felt the shockwave shoot up his legs and spine like an electric jolt and had nearly fallen over, only to be supported by his pod at the last second. Nines didn't take another step until his legs stopped feeling like jelly. Confident he could take another step, he pushed onward, carefully hewing close to whatever he could hide behind. Every moment a passerby came too close for comfort, every time he ducked under something or dove behind something to keep himself hidden, every second he spent immobile, waiting for the danger to pass, was an interminable delay in his eventual freedom. The closer he got, the larger Alfie's lab grew, the more impatient he became. When Nines found himself pinned down behind a pile of metal crates while a pair of heavily armored guards stood around a water cooler bemoaning the heat and humidity, the wait was agonizing enough to set his teeth on edge. The longer these two guards stood and talked about nothing, the harder it was to stay put. He had half a mind to lunge at them and beat them to death with his bare hands, or better yet, the stupid water cooler they were standing around. Cooler heads prevail, Nines, he told himself, quelling the violent instincts swirling around his head. Those stupid Type E protocols kept getting him into these messes. As soon as he had a chance, he swore he'd uninstall them. Nines took stock of his surroundings, hoping he could find something to use to distract these knuckleheads. Both guards were currently patting themselves down for spare change, wishing very loudly that they could afford some sodas from the vending machine and loudly complaining about the prices of the pastries set on a flimsy table standing between the machine and the water cooler. Nines decided that the best way to both make his escape and blow off some steam was to indulge them, so he hacked into the machine and started firing bottles of soda at the poor guards at full force until they beat a hasty retreat. At least he didn't murder them. Nines took what little opportunity he had to run before the guards could return and catch sight of him, stopping only to steal a croissant and fill a flimsy paper cup with water to wet his parched throat before moving on, ducking into a gloomy manor that seemed to have been scooped up from the ruins and plopped down on the parched rock. Not a single light was on, every elegant window revealed only a pitch-black abyss on the inside. The door was unlocked. The inside of the house was so dark that Nines felt comfortable in assuming it was empty. Closing the door behind himself, he let out a relieved sigh. Here, he'd catch his breath, slip out the back door, and be back on his way. He tore into his purloined croissant, trying his best to savor the flaky pastry even as his instincts screamed at him to cram the whole thing into his mouth and eat it without chewing, his stomach churning with phantom hunger. As he finished his meal, Nines crouched down, bowed his head, and let the throbbing aches running through his limbs wash through him. He wanted so badly to keep moving, but he was just so tired. His arm was broken, he'd been pumped full of venom and beaten up, his legs burned and ached. Alphys could fix him, or at least help him deal with the pain. But until then, Nines had to go on. He had to keep pushing himself forward, and forward, and forward. For the first time since it had been reunited with Nines, Pod 153 spoke up. Incoming transmission from Unit 2B. Okay. Nines closed his eyes as 2B's voice surrounded him. Her real voice, not a recording. Nines. Are you there? There was a brisk, urgent undercurrent of concern in her hushed voice. Nines nodded. Yeah, he whispered, his voice hoarse and quiet as a stone formed in his throat. I'm here. Are you hurt? A little, he lied. 2B, I'm so glad to hear your voice, they both said at once. Nines couldn't help but smile. Did you have a good sleep? I've had better. I'm sorry. I should have been there for you when you woke up. 9S's chest ached anew. He wished so badly that 2B could be here with him, that she could wrap her arms around him and he could nestle his head on her shoulder, that he could feel her soft hair brush against his cheek and her fingers stroke his hair as she caressed his mangled body, and she could tell him everything would be okay now because she was here. It's okay. I'm coming after you. I'm almost at the lab, it won't be long, so stay put. No, 2B, I'll make it back. Nines stood up on unsteady legs and made his way through the darkened foyer, fumbling in the dark. I'm on my way. Something wispy and sticky clung to his arm, tugging on it as Nines pulled himself forward. Tearing his arm free, Nines activated Pod 153's flashlight, illuminating the manor. He saw rows of bookshelves, tables, and chairs all covered with dust, the remains of an ancient crystal chandelier hanging from the arched ceiling, vases, and statues, and faded paintings in gaudy frames. And everywhere he looked, spider webs crisscrossing the air, leaping from chair to table, from urn to vase, streaming from the chandelier to the staircase leading to the second floor of the ancient house. Somehow, though he hadn't felt it before, the floor, too, was coated in a layer of webbing, clinging to the solace of his boots. Glistening black spiders scurried across the threads, weaving new webbing over the old with lightning speed. Normally, none of this would worry 9S. He found spiders to be fascinating creatures, but what did worry him was the revelation that he was not alone in this old, bleak house. At the top of the stairs, leaning coquettishly on the dusty banister, was a lavender-skinned monster with 6 long and spindly arms, dark hair done up in lavish braids, a ruffled red dress, and 5 shiny black eyes that all blinked in sequence. While her 2 right forearms rested on the banister, one of her 2 left hands rested on her cheek while the other held a cup of tea. The monster smiled, revealing 2 shiny black fangs. Oh, dearie me, look who's wandered into my parlor, she cooed in a sickly sweet voice. Nines turned around, not willing in the least bit to deal with any of this garbage, but found a thick, white, gauze-like coating of silken webbing already covered the door like a cocoon. You're not going anywhere, darling. The monster let out another girlish laugh. Not until you've had a lovely evening with little Miss Muffet. Oh, come on. Nines tore his boots free of the sticky webbing, only to put his foot down and immediately get stuck again. This is the last thing I'm in the mood to put up with right now. He turned to Pod 153. Pod. Fire. The spiders under Muffet's command had already ensnared the support pod, tangling its black hull and writhing manipulator arms in a snarled knot of webbing. Ah, I see. You think your taste is too refined for our pastries, don't you? Muffet asked, her giggling laughter echoing throughout the foyer. I disagree with that notion. I think your taste is exactly what this next batch needs. All Undine wanted to do was go home. Well, not home, not back to Waterfall, but rather back to Alphys. It was funny how she hated Hotland so much, yet enjoyed spending time with Alphys nevertheless. But, after all, the 2 of them were in the same sinking boat, both bailing out the water before they capsized and plugging the holes in the hull and commiserating in their mutual pain and peril. At her house, she was alone. In Alphys' lab, the 2 of them could sink into each other's arms after a long day. Having a tyrant for a boss wasn't something Undine wanted to talk to someone like Papyrus about. Not him, not such a sweet, happy-go-lucky guy who'd be sure to say something upbeat and well-meaning that wouldn't quite manage to soothe her because it was too upbeat and too well-meaning and it would ring hollow no matter how sincere he was. Going to Jerson like she'd done earlier almost felt like a mistake in hindsight. Now she just felt even more unmoored, knowing now that Ascari had been lying all along. Alphys understood, though, because she and Undine were in this mess together. Instead, Undine was wrangling a bunch of prisoners who'd broken out of jail while Snacka chased after 9 seconds. As Undine muscled a miscreant back into his cell, she hoped Nines was safe, but again, she reminded herself, not for his sake. Chapter 45, The Ouroboros Unleashed. 2B paused to catch her breath, clutching at her side as a sharp pain ran through her torso like a bolt from the blue and drove the air from her lungs. Pod 042 wasted no time in explaining to her that the alloys used to replace damaged beyond repair portions of her chassis had less tensile strength and flexibility. The pain she was currently feeling was a result of overexertion and would pass after only a few minutes if she slowed down and stopped straining herself. She did, but only for a few seconds, ducking into a patch of tall swamp grass and taking just enough time to steady her breathing and get her internal temperature down to something more manageable. Slowing down wasn't an option. Alphys, what's happened to 9S? She asked. The last thing she'd heard before her all-too-brief conversation with him had been cut short had been a sharp peal of unfamiliar, coquettish laughter. I am still receiving data from his pod, somehow, but not a lot. I'll try triangulating his location. 2B heard the sound of Alphys' claws tapping on a keyboard. Oh, good. He's at Muffet's house. Who? As she runs those overpriced spider bake sales. Overall, she's harmless, but Alphys paused. It's not her he has to worry about. The royal guards closing in on him. 2B peeked through the thick grove of swamp grass she'd dove into, spying the shore of a swift, narrow river. Large ice floes bobbed in the dark water. This river led to the core's cooling system. If I follow the river, she asked her guides, would I? Don't even think about it, Alphys said. I'll take you way off course, and dump you into a pool of boiling, radioactive water. In such an environment, Pod 042 said, Unit 2B would be in extreme risk of fatally overheating. Proposal, Unit 2B should find a safer, more direct route. You're coming up on Outpost 43, 60 told 2B, her voice ringing in her left ear. Be careful. The Waterfall Hotland border is a lot more heavily guarded now. They've got. Some of the guards at this station are pretty tough, Alphys warned, her voice dueling with 60's in 2B's right ear. And they have EMP weapons. You'll have to be extra careful as some of the replacement material in your endoskeleton is more conductive, so those kinds of weapons could hurt you a lot more. Roger. 2B stood up, pressed on her side where the stitch had been to make sure the pain had faded away, and pressed onward. The outpost, its two-story fortifications spanning the width of the cavern and its highest points reaching from the floor nearly to the ceiling, was a hodgepodge of hastily erected walls and platforms, bristling with Royal Guard personnel. It reminded 2B of the structures the resistance constructed on the front lines of the war on the surface, inelegant, ramshackle, built in a hurry and fortified as needed. As 2B drew closer, the guards stationed on the ramparts took notice of her and tossed salvos of magical projectiles her way. The bullets were slow-moving, but the patterns they traveled in were complex and difficult to avoid waves and helices. 2B was hit a few times, the impacts sending waves of pain through her body and pushing her back. But Pod 042's machine gun fire calibrated to be non-lethal, out of respect for Undyne's wishes was faster and far more direct, if not a bit ungraceful, and quickly dispatched the snipers. Shrugging off the pain as it faded, 2B picked up speed. The gate to the outpost was closed, but the skeletal scaffolding clinging to the wall showed another point of entry. With a running jump, 2B reached for the lowest platform, her fingers digging into the metal grating as she dangled over the edge. Taking notice of her, a machine loitering on the ramparts, a medium bipped with the Royal Guard insignia printed on its torso, hurried down the scaffolding, raising a thick and heavy broadsword and letting out an electronic battle cry. For the glory of King Chara. Glory to monster kind. 2B pulled herself up, swinging her leg up and rolling onto the platform just in time to raise her arm and parry the blow with the buckler mounted to her forearm. She struggled to push the machine back, the clash of metal sending reverberations like the tolling of a bell up her arm, and with one fluid stroke swung her blade out from its idle position beneath her shield and sliced through the machine's arm. As the machine reeled back, 2B laid a hand on its torso and shoved it aside, throwing it off the platform. It hit the ground with a thud. The machine was heavier than she recalled these types of machines being, or perhaps she was merely weaker. Ascending to the ramparts, 2B wasted no time in leaping down to the ground on the opposite side of the wall, much to the chagrin of two guards who'd lunged at her from the left and right and collided with each other. 2B hit the ground running, enemies closing in on her from all sides. Would you mind telling me? 2B asked, hissing through gritted teeth as she parried a strike from one of the 6 blade-tipped legs of a massive multi-legged machine that scuttled, crab-like, across the ground. Why, there are machines here. She narrowly avoided another machine's spear as it attacked from the other side, ripping the spear from its hands and tossing it aside, then slicing the machine's short legs out from under it. Machines are just as able to join the guard as any other subject of the king, Alphys explained. The guard has a new policy now. To any outsider who joins get all their other citizenship requirements waived. Beats taking a written exam, 2B muttered, recalling the exhaustive studying she and Nines had to do to become citizens. The crab-like machine reared back on its hind legs and struck at her. She slipped just out of reach in the nick of time. Arcs of lightning coursed down the machine's front legs, and as the arcs strayed close to 2B, she felt an uncomfortable tugging sensation inside patches of her arms and legs. As she grappled with the machine, she felt as though small parts of her body were trying to tear themselves away from her. This must have been the adverse effects of electromagnetic weaponry Alphys had mentioned earlier. The machine pinned her down, its electrified legs pressing against 2B's body and immobilizing her. 2B felt a wave of nausea sweep through her, as if her insides were revolting. Her arms went numb and bright, searing colors began to flash before her eyes as the high voltage played havoc with her visual processor. 2B cut off the blade tip of one of the machine's legs, grabbed the freed blade, and jammed it into the knee joint of the other front leg, immobilizing the machine and pulling herself free. As the multi-legged machine limped away to metaphorically lick its wounds and 2B shook the distortion and hallucinations out of her head, she just barely took notice of a black armored guardsman running at her from behind. With one strike, 2B severed his forearms, planted her boot in his stomach, and kicked him away, sending him flying into a pile of sandbags. Why, you really are cutting off a lot of people's, arms, aren't you? Alphys nervously stammered. I'm not killing them, 2B pointed out, noting that the running tally of fatalities Pod 042 kept on display in the corner of her HUD was still hovering at around 0. Why yeah, but, what kind of a life can you live without any arms? 2B sighed and pressed onward, her pod laying down suppressing fire to hold back the remaining guards. You should be happy. When this is over, dozens of people will flock to you for prosthetic limbs. Gee, thanks. Why not try just breaking their arms? It'll put them out of commission for weeks, and then I won't have to build robot arms for everyone. Understood. 2B caught the next guard to lunge at her, twisted the dagger out of their hand, jabbed them in the eye, and snapped their forearm like a twig. It was a little more work to do things this way, but it was somehow, in a deeply visceral way, satisfying. Nines struggled in vain against the webbing ensnaring him as Muffet walked down the staircase toward him. He knew that spider silk was stronger than steel by weight, but had never imagined he'd ever be in a situation where he'd be on the receiving end of a practical examination. The fuzzy, sticky cocoon burying him up to his neck made him feel like a pupating silkworm larva. And when you were surrounded by spiders, a bug was the last thing you wanted to feel like. Could these spiders eat him? Probably not. Nines doubted synthetic android flesh was readily digestible. Could they try? Absolutely. Would the attempt kill him? Probably. Muffet paused as she reached the foot of the stairs to take a sip of her tea. Oh, relax, she said. I use that line on everybody. I'm not really going to eat you. I wouldn't taste good, anyway. Oh, don't be sour grapes, Muffet pouted. Yes, I could liquefy your flesh and make a fine pastry dough with it, but the amount of money I get selling authentic android croissants would be paltry compared to the bounty the kingdom has on your head. Muffet gestured to the interior of the musty old house. My people have been trapped in the ruins for generations, as the cold of Snowdon is quite fatal to us insects. It took every penny I had to bring my house out of the ruins, you see, and I had to leave so many of my kind behind, and at the rate my baked goods are selling, she said, sniffling and wiping a tear from one of her black, almond-shaped eyes, it will be many years before I have enough money for a heated carriage to carry my brethren through the treacherous cold. I'm so glad I could be of use to you, Nines said. And of course, once King Chara has your soul, we'll be able to go to the surface, as well. And, oh, how wonderful that will be. Until the first winter, Nines muttered. Oh, and by the way, the warmth left Muffet's face, and her five-eyed gaze became cold and hard. Nines felt like an ant under a magnifying glass as his black box warmed up a few degrees. Did you know a fellow in the Royal Guard by the name of Form ICK? Nines shook his head. He was part of the late King Ascary's personal entourage on the day their Royal Highness Chara killed him, Nines completed. Form ICK must have been one of the guards in charge of looking after 6-0 when Chara had gone after her. And he was my cousin. Muffet examined her sharp, scarlet fingernails. Third cousin twice removed. Or second cousin 3 times removed. Oh, it is so hard to keep all the in-laws and step-siblings straight when your grandmother had 1,000 babies. But I digress. All the more reason to let me go. Your beloved king murdered. No, dear. Muffet let out a mirthless laugh. You killed him. It was because of you androids and Ascary's treasonous loyalty to you that King Chara was forced to dispatch him. His dust covers your hands. And speaking of dust on your hands, I was listening to the radio just before you arrived and heard that something terrible has happened to an old friend of mine. Well, more like a cousin's former roommate. Perhaps the name, Jim, rings a bell. Nines felt his sins crawling up his back. Or maybe they were spiders. One of them crawled over his mouth, tickling his lips as it traced a line of webbing in its wake. Yep. Spiders. 2B soon found herself standing in a familiar field of luminescent echo flowers. A susurrus of softly whispered wishes engulfed her as she passed through. She hadn't been here in a while. She didn't normally take this path to get into Hotland, but this place was burned into her memory. This was the place she had first met Undine. Where the two of them had fought, where 2B had first realized how strong monsters could be, and how deadly they could be. Further on, in the tunnels leading to Hotland, was the place where Nines had. Where he'd died. Where he'd died, for the first time not by her hand, where she'd watched the life drain from his eyes and had been truly powerless, where she'd truly had no say in the matter and had only been able to stand by and watch. These waving flowers carried the memories of so many past conversations but knew nothing of 9SS death, of Undine's righteous rage, of the pasts that had never happened. 2B alone carried the burden of those memories, carried the burden of knowing that there had been a time when she had so carelessly and callously cut down people she would have soon learned to see as friends, as family. 2B, are you okay? Sixo asked, startling 2B out of her reverie. 2B shook her head and recomposed herself. I'm fine, she insisted, hurrying into the tunnels. The air around her grew hotter and more humid as Hotland neared. How's 9S? Not moving. But the guards in the area, Alphys seemed to chew on her words, then groaned. Oh, no. Muffet probably called the cops to collect the bounty on his head. 2B picked up speed. She wasn't going to stand by and watch Nines die again. 2B, I was going to ask you to stop by my lab so I could equip UW with the rest of the celestial being set, Alphys told her, but since you're taking the lower entrance to Hotland, I'll be too far out of your way. I'm sorry I can't do anything more for you. Her voice cracked. Why you're sure you can do this, right? You've done plenty, Alphys, 2B assured her. Don't worry about me. I'll take it from here. In front of her, Hotland beckoned, and gazing out at the infernal lake, 2B didn't need any confirmation from her pod to know that Nines was out there waiting for her. Nines raised his voice. I'll pay you double whatever my bounty is if you let me go, he told Muffet. It wasn't quite a bluff. Toriel had a lot of money stockpiled from when she'd parted ways with Ascari, and there was probably more than twice whatever the price on his head was tucked away in her home. Muffet laughed, then looked at all four of her wrists to note the time. I'm afraid the Royal Guard will be here any minute, so we don't have time to negotiate your release. Besides. Triple, Nines offered. Muffet blinked and swallowed hard. You have 300 million G? Yes. Nines said. 100 million? That's insane. I had no idea they were offering that much for me, he thought. Does the Royal Treasury even have that much money to spend? Yes, he repeated with much more confidence. Barely, but yes. If you let me get my arm free, I can write you a check. Muffet set down her teacup and snapped her fingers. Nines almost saw dollar signs pop up in her eyes. Oh, yes, certainly, dearie. She laughed as Nines felt spiders scuttle over his left arm and begin pulling away the webbing keeping him bound. Well, this works out for everyone nicely, doesn't it? I get my money, my people can rejoin me in this lovely climate, and I get my revenge on you by making you financially destitute. Only a thin coating of webbing was draped on 9SS left side now. With his freed hand, he brushed it away. Actually, ma'am, my checkbook's in my right pocket, so I need my right side free, too. Muffet chuckled. Say no more. And I'm sorry about Jim. It was kind of a heat of the moment thing, Nines said as the spiders pulled away the rest of the webbing. Oh, I was kidding about that. I barely knew him. Or for my CK. Muffet smiled, baring her sharp, shiny black fangs and pinching 9SS cheek. I just wanted to frighten you, dearie. Nines sighed with relief. So you lied about calling the Royal Guard, 2. No, Muffet said, grimacing sheepishly. I called them as soon as you stepped inside here. I needed that reward money. How was I supposed to know you were so obscenely wealthy? A heavy hand knocked on the door to the mansion, echoing through the musty foyer and rattling the windows. Ah, that must be them, Muffet said, her sugary demeanor returning to her as she slipped past Nines and made her way to the front door. I will stall them while you, empty your coffers. Nines unwrapped pod 153 and made a big show out of rifling through his pockets while Muffet attended to the door. All things considered, this wasn't as bad a situation as it could be. Maybe it wasn't even the royal guard at the door. Maybe 2B had found him. Sure, that was a long shot, but it was within the realm of possibility. Hello, Miss, Muffet? This is Lieutenant Snacka of the Royal Guard. I received your call about a dangerous fugitive who ran into your house. Oh, him. Terribly sorry, darling, but he escaped out the back door just before you arrived. Muffet laughed. I am so sorry to have made you come all this way. Can I get you some tea? Or some spider cider on the house? What about a spider donut? You royal guards must have worked up an appetite. Nines pretended to write a check and pondered his next move. Escaping out the back door was right out. That was the next place the guards would check. So that left. One of the other guards spoke up. This is Corporal Foucault 6291 of the Royal Guard. We would like to search the premises. A machine. Nines glanced over his shoulder. Muffet was blocking the door to hide him from the guards so he couldn't see them either. But that harsh, electronic blare could only be the voice of a machine. He couldn't believe his luck. A machine was the best thing Captain Undine could have sent after him. Still his guardian angel, even though she hated his guts. Undine was one hell of a friend. Muffet continued to stall the guards. Well, I suppose if you must. She glanced over her shoulder at Nines, her eyes meeting his for only the briefest fraction of a second before following the staircase up. Oh, but I haven't dusted in ages. Nines made his way up the staircase. Muffet expected him to hide out in one of the upstairs rooms, but he had a better idea, although he'd only have a short window of opportunity to pull it off. Muffet turned around and let the guards in. 2 of them. Snacka and the machine identified as Foucault, a small sphere type, floating in the air with a long axe held in their spindly arms. Oh, no! Muffet shouted out as she caught sight of Nines on the staircase. The fiend was here all along. Nines wasted no time hacking into Foucault and taking control, and before Snacka could even think of leaping into battle, he turned the machine's axe on her, swinging the blade through the air and nearly decapitating her before activating Foucault's self-destruct function. He turned tail and ran further up the staircase until he reached the second-floor hallway. Seconds later, Foucault self-destructed, the explosion rocking the house down to its foundations. Nines braced himself, gritted his teeth, grabbed onto pod 153, and threw himself through the second-floor window, tucking in his legs and hitting the ground rolling. Why is it always the window? Nines asked himself as he picked himself up off the parched, baked ground and shook the glass out of his hair. He'd landed on his numb and broken right shoulder, which was thankfully incapable of feeling anything other than a dull, throbbing soreness. Unit 9's right arm has sustained further damage. Analysis: repair may no longer be possible. Nines pulled himself to his feet and took off. It's busted to hell and back anyway. Not like it can get any more broken at this point. An unusable appendage may restrict Unit 9's combat capabilities. Proposal: Unit 9s should seek out Dr. Alphys for triage. I'll get it looked at when I get a chance. Nines reached the edge of this islet, the heat from the channel of magma several meters below rolling over him. The rest of Hotland stretched out before him, islands both natural and artificial shimmering in the heat. Pod, can you locate 2B? Affirmative. Running triangulation scan. Unit 2B is currently on the west side of Hotland. So close. After so long. Then we'll meet in the middle. With renewed resolve, Nines crossed the metal platform suspended over a pipeline that ran from one island to the next to form a crude bridge. Can you send her a message? Nines felt something yank backwards as he ran and fell flat on his back, the back of his head slamming into the metal grating. He tried to pull himself up as something dragged him back. Something. A harpoon embedded in his right bicep. With how fucked up his arm was already, he hadn't even noticed he'd been hit. On the other end of the long, taut cable trailing from the harpoon stood Snaka, her entire right side blackened from the explosion, her visor torn away, her armor scorched, and her eyes blazing red. She yanked on the cable as Nines tried to pull himself to her feet, sending him tumbling back down. "You put me through hell," Snaka bared her fangs. "Why don't I return the favor?" With serpentine grace, she lunged at Nines, weaving through Pod 153's hail of gunfire, her talons tearing at 9's shirt as he wearily backed away from her advances. The harpoon embedded in his arm kept Nines tethered to her. It was all he could do to put even a little distance between himself and the vicious snake. Whenever Nines got more than a few steps away, Snaka simply yanked him back within range of her sweeping claws. "There's no use running. Of all King Chara's soldiers, of all their apostles, I am their most devoted and I won't dare let them down." Snaka raked her claws across 9's chest, leaving deep gouges that tingled and stung as the blood welling from them smoked and sizzled. Nines stumbled backward, clutching at his chest. The dosage of venom he'd just gotten wasn't as plentiful or as concentrated. It didn't seem like it would put him to sleep any time soon, but with each passing second, it stung more. "Great Undine impression you've got there," he defiantly spat. The barbed comment slipped out all too easily, although Nines knew he probably should have kept the quip to himself. "Got anything original to show me?" Snaka reeled him back in with the harpoon and struck Nines, her talons carving bloody furrows up across his face from chin to forehead. Her other hand made a fist and rocketed into his gut. But in such close quarters, she had less room to dodge, and Pod 153's gunfire managed to land on a weakened section of her armor, liberating a gout of blood from her side as bullets peppered her flesh. Seizing the opportunity, Nines grabbed the harpoon stuck in his arm and tried to snap it, but why couldn't his fingers curl tightly enough around the shaft? Oh, no. He was getting worse. Falling apart faster now. Snaka whirled around, her long and muscular tail blindsiding Nines and hitting him in the side of the head. Static flickered past his vision as everything went gray, and Nines staggered and stumbled, barely staying on his feet. "This lunatic's really gonna beat me to death." Nines felt a vice squeeze his chest, mingling with the pain from the venom, the heartache indistinguishable from Snaka's beating as a static haze filled his sight. "Not now, when I was so close." As she fought her way through the next outpost, 2B was struck with déjà vu. Running after 9 seconds, fighting past waves of enemies. This was just like last time. It wasn't so dark this time, although the air in Hotland was so dry, thick, and hot that it felt just as oppressive as the darkness. There were no tight corridors like in the depths of Alfie's laboratory between precarious ravines and rivulets of molten rock draining into the lake. 2B had ample room to maneuver. But the thought kept running through her mind, and no matter how quickly she ran through the lower levels of Hotland, cliffs from the rocky, obsidian-laced plateaus on either side of her looming over her, 2B could not outrun her growing anxiety. What if I'm too late again? A cluster of black-armored royal guards and machines leaped in front of 2B. As she blocked the strike from one monster's sword, another stabbed at her with a radiant spear, tearing through her coat. 2B struck them both down with a single swing of her blade. She didn't bother checking to make sure she hadn't killed them. Pod 042's running tally of fatalities remained at 0, so 2B just kept going, tearing through the machines next. 2B. Alphys spoke up. "Why, you could have killed those." "Yes? And what of it?" 2B snapped as a spiked flail slammed into her abdomen, knocking her into the waiting embrace of another guard lying in wait behind her. She kicked the guard in the shin, grabbed them by the shoulders, and threw them into her other opponent. It's just that, you said." "I said, did I?" 2B stabbed one of the fallen guards through the shoulder and watched them writhe before she yanked the blade free. The guard curled up and played dead. 2B nodded in approval. A ragged yell rang out behind her, and 2B turned around just to find one of the guards she'd dispatched, his shattered arm flopping at his side, bearing down on her with a heavy, electrified hand axe. The blade bit into 2B's shoulder, sending convulsing electrical current through her muscles. She grabbed the handle of the axe, tore the blade from her shoulder, and grappled with the guard, staring into the emerald optical sensors of his helmet. 2B kneed him in the groin with so much force that the guard immediately went limp and collapsed to the ground, vomit leaking from the seam between his helmet and his neck. Another guard rose up and lunged at her. Pod 042 opened fire and blew their arm off. It was so pointless. Injure them, and they'd come back and have another shot at killing you. Kill them, and they would never trouble you again. 2B, are you all right? Alphys asked. I'm fine. No thanks to your insistence on handicapping me. Alphys was scandalized. 2B. Truth be told, 2B wasn't used to talking back to people when she'd served in Yoarha. She'd obeyed every order without question, for better and for worse. But now she couldn't resist the urge. What? 2B pressed onward, dispensing with the usual finesse. The monsters in her path grew more hesitant in their attacks and began pointedly keeping their distance. The machines, with their greater durability, retained their gung-ho attitudes and continued to attack her head-on. For every 5 seconds I spend sparing these enemies, she said, exasperated, I could take half the time to just kill them. What if I'm a second too late? N9s. 9s is gonna be fine, 2B, Alphys insisted. And what if he isn't? 2B retorted. Am I the only one who cares about him? No. Oh, of course not. But, Alphys sighed. If you kill everyone who gets in your way, then this is all over. You won't be able to go back to the way things used to be. No one will see you as anything other than a murderer. 2B gritted her teeth, cutting through the next wave of enemies in front of her, bringing her sword to one of her foes' throats. One thrust, and this one would never hurt anybody. She stopped. She'd fought her way through this place before, fought and killed, and where had it brought her then? Ascari's voice rang in her head. They may call me a coward for that, and they will be right. But it is a terrible thing to have blood on one's hands, is it not? Even worse, sometimes, than being a coward? Undine, too. Her accusatory words still haunted 2B, 2 timelines later. You don't know how to do anything but kill. I'm sorry, Alphys. 2B walked past the fallen soldier, took a deep breath, and sighed, shrugging off the smarting pain riddling her body from the injuries she'd sustained in battle. I shouldn't have snapped at you. I mean. I get it. I'm afraid for 9s, too, Alphys admitted. Don't let me slow you down. Just do what it takes to save him. Roger that. 2B turned to Pod 042. Pod, plot me the most direct course to 9SS current location. Map analysis in progress. Creating proposed route. The directions populated 2B's HUD, and steeling herself, she soldiered on. Snacka yanked on the cable again, drawing 9s back within range of her talons. 9s only had a split second to make his next move. Pod, deactivate the shoulder seam on my right arm, he shouted out. Pod 153 responded instantly, sending the necessary codes to 9SS motor systems to seal and sever all vessels and circuits and detach right arm, liberating the arm from his torso at just the right moment. Freed so abruptly of the great weight she'd been tugging on, Snacka flew backward, her harpoon with 9SS skewered right arm flying along with her as she hit the bridge. 9s took off down the bridge while he had the chance, limping to freedom as quickly as he could. Pod, what's in this pipeline? He asked, pointing to the pipes running beneath the metal grating. Analyzing. Result, this is a water pipeline. Water, huh? 9SS eyes drifted to the river of magma below. Pod, will a laser pierce these pipes? Analysis, the pipes were not designed to withstand energy-based attacks. Snacka pulled herself to her feet, clutching at her side. Then fire. Snacka's eyes widened as she wrapped her arms over her chest in a futile attempt to protect herself. On 9SS orders, Pod 153 aimed downward and fired through the grated platform, through the pipes, and into the magma below. Great torrents of water gushed from the holes bored into the pipes and poured onto the molten rock, creating an opaque white cloud of boiling steam that wrapped around the bridge and consumed both its passengers. 9s could feel the intense heat scald his exposed skin as he ran to safety, not stopping until he was free of the steam and standing on solid rock, lying on solid rock. His clothes, dampened by flash condensation, clung to his raw skin. As an android, his skin was resilient to such high temperatures, but Snaka? Well, a monster wouldn't be so lucky. Snaka should have been cooked through by the intense heat. Thanks, 153, Nines muttered, rolling onto his back and sitting up. He reached out for his support pod, taking its readily offered claw and using it to pull himself up. A lifesaver, as always. Statement: this support unit is merely following its programming. However, I take great pleasure in doing so. Nines smiled. Query: how is Unit 9's feeling? Pod 153 asked as it helped Nines up. Nines leaned against it like it was a floating crutch. Why don't you run another analysis? Statement: analysis only reveals the physical condition of an assigned YORHA unit. This support unit will repeat its query: how is Unit 9's feeling? I don't think I can tell you anything you don't already know. I feel like I look. Nines tried to wipe the blood from his eyes before remembering that he only had one arm now, and it was currently grabbing hold of Pod 153's arm for support. Nines couldn't help but feel sorry for Alphys. She'd taken 9 months to piece together his arm and get it in working order, and 50 days later, he'd managed to completely trash it. Nines watched the steam clear away as the cooling magma below the bridge blackened and hardened, sighed. But his breath caught in his throat. Snaka was still standing in the middle of the bridge. Nines sputtered as he pushed the stale air from his lungs. Oh, come on. Hotland was the industrial hub of the kingdom, with the core, Alphys lab, and the foundry built through the lower levels all drawing on the bounty of geothermal energy provided by the flowing magma running through the massive chamber. Weaving off and on conveyor belts, around massive moving pieces of machinery, 2B felt strangely at home fighting the machines that stood in her way. As 2B crossed the metal scaffolding pulling her up from the lower levels of Hotland and away from the worst of the heat rolling off the scorching magma, a massive Goliath-class machine dropped down in front of her, shaking the metal platforms so intensely that all 2B could do was struggle to barely hang on. The Goliath machine was peculiarly ornamented, its outer casing plated with shimmering gold leaf. 2B. How fortunate that we should meet here of all places, a familiar voice issued from the machine as its torso unfolded, revealing a very familiar face within it. I've never had a chance, Met-Aten went on, his faceplate lighting up with glee, to pay you and your boy back for all the humiliations you've laid upon my beautiful visage. Now, 2B, he crowed, the massive machine he was piloting raising a heavy fist, prepare to D. 2B did not mince words. Get out of my way. She cut down the machine's legs with one swift stroke and let it tumble to the floor of the foundry far below. The machine crashed onto the conveyor belt and slowly began to travel toward a glowing pool of molten steel as Met-Aten hurriedly pulled himself out of his cockpit, shaking a fist at 2B as she ascended. Snaka threw herself at Nines with nearly double the speed and ferocity as before, tackling him to the ground, the world spinning around Nines before he came to a stop. Pod 153's suppressing fire bounced off her sharpened scales, as she pinned Nines to the ground, acrid spit dripped from her wide-open mouth and sizzled and smoked as it hit Nines' skin. Her eyes had turned jet black, her slitted pupils stark white. After her strange transformation, she now resembled more a wingless dragon than a snake. Nines had seen a transformation like this before, he realized. In some ways not quite as dramatic, in some ways more, but it seemed Snaka had inadvertently stolen another trick from Undyne's book. Snaka swatted Pod 153 away and drew back her right arm, the mouth on her palm wide and gaping, and somehow, the mouth gaped wider, the seam traveling up her arm to her elbow, and her entire forearm opened up and transformed into a long, fanged muzzle. Nines couldn't move. Was it the pain? The venom? The fatigue? A mix of all three? Was this the end? Why here? Why now? Why am I here? What brought me to this point? Nines was a scanner. He was designed to be curious, analytical, detail-oriented. And, of course, as a unit designed primarily for information gathering and reconnaissance, there wasn't much point in him being brash or headstrong or self-sacrificing. He was never supposed to be as violent or bloodthirsty as a combat model. But there was a part of him that defied his programming, a piece of his personality that didn't quite fit with his design, a part of him that only came out with his anger, with his hatred. A part of him that relished the pain he could inflict. It was the part of him that had come out when he'd stared down 6E and told her he would kill every single one of her kind. It was the part of him that had nearly killed 2B when he'd been stripped of his soul. The nightmares still visited him, less frequent 10 months later but just as potent when they did come. It was the part of him that had brought him here, at the end of his hope, to go out in a blaze of violence and glory. It was a part of Nines he wished did not exist. He'd indulged it for so long now, listening to its siren song brush against his ear all the while 2B had been in her coma and allowing it to guide him to what he'd thought had been an awful truth, that she was gone forever, that Nines had nobody now but himself, and that he had no recourse but revenge. He'd given himself to his rage, given himself over to the darkest and most hateful depths of his heart, and thrown himself to the wolves. Because what could there be in life without 2B to join him? What point was there in living, longing for the love of someone who no longer existed? And the cruelest twist of fate of all, by the time he'd heard 2B's voice at last, he'd already crossed the point of no return. Now he was here, crippled and broken by his own design, pulled inexorably to this ignoble end by his own poor decisions. Nines didn't want to be what he'd become. He had to be better than this. To be stronger than this. But that opportunity had passed him by, hadn't it? Because this was the end. No. There was one last resort. One last thing he'd developed using 2B's Type E protocols and combat data. Yoarha combat models had once been equipped with a Berserker mode, dubbed B mode, which temporarily boosted the power output of a unit in exchange for lowering its stamina and defenses. Nines had reverse-engineered it and rerouted his own self-destruct functions around it. He'd known his body wouldn't be able to handle it, especially not now. Using it would probably kill him. He'd been planning to save it as a last resort when he went after Chara, but when he'd found out that 2B was back, he'd set his suicide mission aside. But maybe. If Nines used it to escape here, maybe he'd last long enough to reach 2B and say goodbye to her. It would be better than dying here and never seeing her again. I'm so sorry it had to come to this, 2B. Everything that's happened here today has been my fault. Everything. Because I couldn't control myself. Because I couldn't see past my own hatred and grief. I hope someday you'll forgive me. Nines closed his eyes, took as deep a breath as he could as Snaka moved in for the kill, and activated it. Alert. BM-FC. Engaged. At last, 2B had reached the taller pillars of rock which housed the sparse residential level of Hotland. Some homes were built into the rock, some on top of it, most were empty, as Hotland was proving less and less a comfortable place to live with each passing year. The signal from 9SS black box grew stronger the closer 2B came to it. Almost there. An electronic scream rang out from behind 2B. She glanced backward just in time to see an exploder, merely a small machine model's legs bolted onto a bomb, possessing no intelligence and scarcely fit to be labeled a machine life form, charging at her. Pod 042 fired on it until it erupted into a pile of shrapnel just meters away from 2B. Even at such a distance, the heat and concussive force from the explosion still pushed her back. A hulking guard, too big to fit into Yoarha armor, attacked from the side. In a single arc of her blade, 2B severed one arm and both legs from his meaty torso and threw him onto the scaffolding she'd just climbed up. Another machine swung a sword at her and she caught it with one hand, blood streaming down her sleeve, and plunged her blade through its head. She watched its optical sensors grow dark. The counter on 2B's HUD shifted from 0 to 1. Just a machine, she told herself, pressing onward. She couldn't afford to care about it. She had to reach Nines, come hell or high water. The first thing Nines felt, strangely enough, was euphoria. Bliss. No pain. But a flood of endorphins running through his mind, melting away the aches and pains, the stinging wounds, the battered muscles. One punch fractured Snaka's skull, as she reared back, clutching at her face in agony, her long and spiked tail whipping angrily behind her. Nines felt himself stand up. Felt himself. Like he wasn't in control of his own body. Like he was a mere observer, his body acting merely on its own instincts, using all of the combat protocols taken from 2B's programming to their full potential with no heed paid to 9S's unsuited physique. The second thing Nines felt was worry. Because he couldn't feel it, but he could somehow see the inside of his body crack and crumble as impossible strength was pulled from his chassis and channeled through his muscles. What had happened to his right arm first would happen to everything else soon. Snaka's tail wrapped around his neck, crushing his throat. He couldn't feel himself overheating, but he knew that without his lungs to carry heat from his internal systems, it would happen soon enough and slammed him into the ground, the rocks cracking and crumbling beneath him. He didn't feel the pain. Everything he did feel was abstract and distant, worlds away. Nines grabbed hold of Snaka's tail, fingers digging into her scales tightly enough to break the skin, and threw her into the air. She righted herself in midair, landing and digging her claws into the ground, rending furrows in the rock as she slid to the edge of the islet. Debris slipped off the lip of the cliff and tumbled to the river of magma a dozen meters below. Snaka charged at him, two swords protruding from the gaping maws on her arms like sharp, metallic tongues. One was 2B's secondary blade, the Joyous. The other was 9S's own sword, the Cruel Oath. Snaka's blade-tipped arms whipped through the air, curling and twisting with all of the flexibility of great jungle snakes, forming a maelstrom of dancing blades Nines could barely avoid, even in spite of the massive boost to his agility and reaction time. At last, he found an opening and dove in, tearing the Cruel Oath free of Snaka's grasp and turning the blade on her. The two swords met and clashed, dancing around each other with a cacophony of ringing metal and a dazzling display of light reflecting across the swift blades. At last, 9S's blade drilled into Snaka's stomach, the force of the impact liberating blood and bile from all three of her gaping, slavering maws. Dust, too, the blood spilling from Snaka's broken body dried and crumbled before it could even hit the ground. Undeterred from the force of the blow, Snaka's arm-mouth latched onto 9S's torso and bit down as she raised her second sword over her head and prepared to strike. Nines couldn't shake her off. Blood and coolant pumped from deep puncture wounds. It didn't hurt at all, but Nines knew that it should hurt, and the fact that he had to remind himself that he'd just sustained what was likely a mortal injury cut through the euphoria of B-mode and filled him with terror. Terror, and sadness. Anguish. This was it. A marvel of reverse engineering even Alphys would be proud of, and it wasn't enough. Snaka shouted something at him, her venomous spit flecking his face, but Nines couldn't hear her. All he could hear was the fevered pitch of his black box. Nines gritted his teeth and kicked her. Evidently, his legs were stronger than his arm, or at least not as worn out. The force of his kick was enough to throw Snaka into the air. However, it wasn't enough to tear Snaka's well-anchored mouth from 9S's midsection. Instead, it tore her arm off right at the elbow. As the ragged jaws clinging to Nines crumbled to dust, Nines felt the high run out. He collapsed. Collapsed, hemorrhaging blood and coolant. Everything hurt, every cubic centimeter of his body, inside and outside, from head to toe. Each breath he took was labored. Nines had been expecting this, but how much agony he was left in still took him by surprise. There was no way to prepare for this kind of pain. He couldn't even summon the mental energy to hack into himself and deaden his pain receptors. Snaka hit the ground just a few meters away from him and slowly, agonizingly slowly, stood up. She stood over him, contempt emanating from the iridescent blue-green shine of every scale on her body. Her remaining arm hung limply at her side, dragging the Joyous against the ground. "It's over," she told him. "From this day forward, no one else will live in fear of you damned machines. From this day on, we'll be free, and I will be the greatest he." In spite of himself, Nines started laughing. You really don't have a single original idea in your head, do you?" he asked Snaka. Enraged, Snaka lifted her foot over 9S's head, about to bring it down on him and crush his skull, or at least try. Almost there. 2B was almost there. Her legs burned. Error messages flickered on her HUD as she pushed her way past every enemy that stepped in her path, not even bothering with fighting even if someone managed to land a hit on her. She wouldn't be too late. Not this time. Not this time. At last, the readings from 2B's HUD pointed her in a straight line. And at last, she saw him. Nines. Collapsed on the ground as a grotesque dragon of a monster stood over him, one clawed foot raised over his head. 2B's heart sank, her black box heating up in her chest as her muscles contracted around it, blood singing in her ears as the whir of her black box was lost to the rapid pumping of coolant through her weary muscles. She wasn't close enough. As fast as she could run, she'd never make it in time. Before Snaka could bring her foot down, a lance of light tore through her stomach, the beam assaulting 9's eyes as it passed overhead, the heat radiating from it singeing his hair and skin. Another laser blast tore through Snaka's midsection from the opposite direction. Her eyes widened, mouth agape, slitted pupils contracted to thin lines as she gasped in agony. Nines struggled to turn his neck, pushing past the searing pain shooting up his neck, and saw Pod 153 struggle to pull itself free of a pile of rubble as it prepared to fire again. Snaka was still standing, even as the burned-away flesh surrounding the two holes in her midsection crumbled and flaked off, widening the holes. Nines hadn't known how Undine had called upon such strength and endurance when she'd fought 6E, but somehow, Snaka had done it as well, clinging to life against all odds. Was it just something exceptionally strong monsters could do? Snaka opened her mouth and dust poured from her jaw in a dry fountain. She stumbled, then raised her sword over 9's head. "King Chara, grant me strength," Snaka croaked, "my angel, my savior, I am your sword. If I perish here, and my unworthy brethren would have died for nothing. I must. 2B saw the glittering blade travel in an agonizingly slow arc, as if the monster standing over Nines was drawing the killing blow out for its own sick satisfaction to an impossible degree. Her arms, her legs, her body felt so heavy and heavier still, as if her chassis were composed entirely of lead with each passing second that she found herself too far away to make a difference. Pod 042 was still cooling down. It couldn't pull off another shot for at least another minute. And by then, it would be too late. Nines seemed to be miles away. No. Not again. Memories flitted through 2B's head of every time Nines had died. Every time he'd died by her hand, and more. The electric spear skewering his skull and leaving a hole all the way through his head where his eye had been. His broken body clinging to hers in the snow as the two of them waited for their systems to fall offline, not knowing if either of them would come back. His empty, blank stare after 2B had torn the machine core from his chest. She couldn't let it happen again. This could not continue. The world around 2B seemed to slow down, the glittering arc of the Joyeuse in the hulking monster's grip now traveling at a ludicrously cruel slowness, as if the air were as thick as molasses. 2B pushed herself forward, her muscles burning. She would not fail Nines again. She would not. As the draconic monster came rushing up to meet her, 2B realized that somehow, everything in the world had slowed to a crawl save for herself. Snaka looked up at the android who'd just murdered her compatriots as the visor they'd worn around their eyes split in two and fluttered to the ground. Red eyes the same crimson as everyone else in the Dreamer family. She was staring into the eyes of Chara Dreamer. When she had been a little girl, Snaka had heard the story over and over again. The story of Chara and Asriel Dreamer. Snaka's mother told her that Chara was the fabled angel, the one who had seen the surface and would return one day to empty the underground. Snaka had always laughed at her superstitions. Chara was dead. They would never return, even if everybody in the kingdom prayed for it every night for 100 years. But now, she was staring at the face of the divine. "Why you? Princess Chara." In the flesh, Chara intoned, setting aside their sword. The cruelty vanished from their grim face, their glare softening. Snaka felt herself laugh. Talk about picking the wrong side. She realized at that moment that Chara was everything her mother had said they were. Divine. And while they had smote her friends, they had elected to spare her, of all people. While Chara set their sights on the android girl Snaka was supposed to protect, the moment the two of them had locked eyes seemingly slipping from their memory, Snaka saw the light. She had been blessed. Chosen. Burdened with glorious purpose by the angel themselves. She would serve Chara to the ends of the earth. She would never give up. Snaka vowed that day, the day she had felt the touch of the divine, that even if somebody killed her, she would not die until she saw her Lord and Master's vision through. She would live where all others died. That was the silent pact she made. The thought of leading her people out of their eons-long imprisonment under the banner of a living God, it filled Snaka with determination. With a glittering flash of shining metal and a shower of blood and dust, Snacka fell to the ground, a neat diagonal line through her perforated torso running from hip to shoulder, cleaving her in two. And standing behind her. Behind her. Nines opened his mouth, but at first, no sound came out. Until, after a second that had felt like an hour, he squeaked out one name. 2B. Nines lifted his arm with all his strength, his fingers trembling, his hand shaking as he reached out to her. Tears built up in his eyes, reducing the world to a blur. The light shining behind 2B as she stood over him lit up the fringes of her silvery white hair like a halo. Nines wondered if the faint blue light that seemed to engulf her was a real phenomenon, or just a hallucination brought on by the extreme damage to his systems. It seemed familiar, like he'd seen it before somewhere. 2B spoke to him. "Oh, Nines." Her voice, soft, hushed, nearly a whisper. Her hand wrapped around his and she knelt down and wrapped her black coat around him, her strong arms curled beneath him, her touch softer and more comforting than Nines could imagine after so long without it. Nines closed his eyes, letting his relief wash a small amount of the pain racking his broken body away. He'd made it. He'd made it this far. If he never woke up again, that would be all right. It was all right now. Because 2B was here. Check the description for the links to the author.